Okay, welcome back. And a thank you to the Carrie M. McGuire Center for Ethics and Public Policy Responsibility and the Perkins School of Theology for its sponsorship. Indeed, we would like to take this portion of the lunch program to express our appreciation of and gratitude for all our conference sponsors, as well as to allow the leader or representative of each to introduce themselves and to say a word or two about the sponsoring organization's mission and program. Afterwards, Phil and I will introduce you to the online Schubert M. Ogden Notebooks project before we reconvene for our third session. But before we do any of that, I would like to take this opportunity to thank a few individuals behind the scenes. First and foremost of whom is Michelle Reed. Is Michelle here? Yes? Please stand up and be recognized. Ms. Reed is the operations manager of Bridwell Library and Press. And I can say wholeheartedly that without her outstanding organizational skills and commanding knowledge of all the required logistics and necessary contact persons, as well as her wise counsel and advice, this conference simply would not have been possible. So thank you again, Michelle. I would also, of course, like to thank everyone who's been helping out with the videography, with the sound system and the mics, the library assistants who've helped us with the webinars. Again, there are countless people who have made this all possible. I hope that some of you have a chance to thank them personally at some point during today's program. I would also like to take this opportunity to recognize my colleagues on the Planning Committee, Reverend Dr. Philip Devenish, better known as Phil, Mr. Anthony Elia, and Dr. Theodore Walker, whose foresight and insight have proved indispensable to making this conference all that it is. And to be sure, I owe a special debt of gratitude to the last of the aforementioned, Dr. Walker, for agreeing to serve not only as co-chair of the conference, but also as my advisor on my dissertation in the GPRS. And I now ask Dr. Walker to say a few words about that program. So Dr. Walker, if you would kindly come on up. Thank you.
The SMU Graduate Program in Religious Studies welcomes the Ogden Gamwell Conference and all who are participating in it, both in person and online. As you have discerned, the graduate program in religious studies is a place that advances academic scholarship on a really high level. And we appreciate those who are interested in scholarship and research and writing. And we have programs in GPRS, Graduate Program of Religious Studies, in 6 areas. Let's see if I can remember what the 6 areas are. Well, of course, biblical studies, church history, religion and culture, and systematic theology and ethics. Anyone interested in studying in those areas should consider studying here. Furthermore, the graduate program in religious studies is blessed with a world-class faculty. This program was founded by Schubert Ogden himself, and Ogdenian standards prevail to this day. So on behalf of the graduate program in religious studies, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. The conference has also been fortunate to receive the sponsorship, as I mentioned before, the Carrie M. McGuire Center for Ethics and Public Responsibility, which is led most ably by its William F. May Endowed Director, Dr. Rita Kirk. Beyond her directorial responsibilities, Dr. Kirk is a professor in the Division of Corporate Communication and Public Affairs at SMU's Meadows School of the Arts and maintains an active consulting practice advising national and international corporations on public policy matters and serving as a sought-after speaker on ethics and communication strategy. She brings a unique blend of academic rigor and practical expertise to her role, informed by her educational background that includes a PhD in communications from the University of Missouri, a master's degree in communications from the University of Arkansas, and a bachelor's degree in communication political science, also from the University of Arkansas. She is also the author of 5 books and numerous articles, with her current research focusing on election integrity and institutional trust. I'm not sure when she sleeps, but there we have it. Dr. Kirk will now say a few words about the McGuire Center. Dr. Kirk.
Well, on behalf of the Carrie McGuire Center for Ethics and Public Responsibility, let me just say thank you for giving us this opportunity to join with you on a very important conference. You know, sometimes we don't take enough time to feed ourselves as academics and to really do deep dives into the things that interest us most. So we leave grad school and we're still looking for that connection that we had back then, the new ideas that engage us and enhance what we do so that we are more fulfilled when we walk into the classroom. I want to introduce the Associate Director, Matt Nadler, who's at the back, who does a lot of our work with interfacing with the various departments on campus. The McGuire Center for Ethics and Public Responsibility came out of a bad time for SMU when we were looking to regain our footing. And in doing that, our founder said that it was really important that the Ethics Center is a university-wide center, that it serves all disciplines in all areas and facets of the university. So I am delighted with the leadership that we have at SMU. I'm particularly delighted with the new dean, who I have been able to work with already to figure out how we can partner to do this and other programs. If you haven't met Theo Walker before or worked with him, you know that he can be very enthusiastic. He is a member of our advisory board. So we have a faculty advisory board, and there's a couple of people in here that serve on that, including Rebecca Miles and Dallas Jingles. There you are behind the post. And when somebody is that enthusiastic about, we've got this great program and we need your support, and you're weighing costs and how much can you stretch a dollar, you get really enthusiastic when they make this kind of offer and put this kind of a program together. So thank you for the speakers who came, for the people who are here today, for your generous and kind welcome for me today. If you have partnerships with us that you would like to suggest, please contact Matt, and he will put you in touch with how we can help for future events and future projects. So thank you for welcoming me today. And by the way, I was delighted when I walked in today that there was no room, and I've been watching the program from the green room next door. So that's a good sign for a conference. Fill them up.
Thank you, Dr. Kirk. I would be remiss not to mention that a significant part The preparation for this conference was made possible by a McGuire Public Service Fellowship, of which I was the beneficiary this past summer. So I'm also personally grateful to two McGuire staff members, one who's already been mentioned, Mr. Matt Nadler, Associate Director of the McGuire Center, and Ms. Riley Bailey, its Program Coordinator, for assistance with the conference and oversight of the fellowship, respectively. The conference has also been blessed to receive the backing and support of the Perkins School of Theology. And here to say a word or two about Perkins is once again its newly installed dean, the Reverend Dr. Brian Stone. Dean Stone.
I will not be speaking in Ogdenese this time. By the way, Theodore Walker, Dr. Theodore Walker, since you like literal meanings of words, what does the word Theodore mean?
Gift of God.
Gift of God. Just want everyone to know that Theodore Walker is a gift from God.
You flatter me, and I like it.
I am delighted that Perkins School of Theology was able to co-sponsor this conference on Ogden and Gamwell. From my viewpoint, Ogden's footprint remains very large at Perkins. When I was in seminary, not here, but long ago, I won't say how many years, I encountered Wesleyan theology, process theology, and liberation theology all at once. This was in the 80s, early 80s. I was convinced from the outset that Wesleyan theology and process theology were complementary. It just seemed automatic. And I found it no surprise that it was institutions with Methodist roots, like Boston University, Southern Methodist University, and Claremont, that personalism and process theologies were most vibrant. I don't think that's an accident. I also found it an incredible commonality between Wesleyan convictions and what many liberation theologians were up to. When I went looking for a graduate school, SMU was the only one I applied to. Because of that, and what I found here, the connections between process theology and liberation theology and Wesleyan theology, and because of Ogden. Good thing I got admitted because it was the only one I applied to. I could see these things coming together, but Dr. Theodore Walker and Dr. Karen Baker Fletcher have kept the connections between neoclassical metaphysics and liberative ethics strong here, and we have a great faculty in that regard. And things have changed a lot since those days. The emphasis at SMU on theological ethics has grown even stronger in recent times. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to be here working alongside scholars like Becca Miles, Steve Long, and Dallas Jingles, doing incredible work in ethics. And I think they've put us on the map in that regard. Of course, we also have a great program in systematic theology and in practical theology, too. But I look forward to working alongside these and other faculty members over the years. Perkins not only has a new dean, but SMU has a new president, has a new provost, 3 new deans, and a new athletic director. It's really on the move. There's a lot of momentum right now at SMU, and I think it's a great place to work. And Perkins is a great school. The football has kind of overshadowed. We're now back, all right, with football. By the way, do you know the only time John Wesley's picture ever made the Sports Illustrated? It was in 1987, and that's, you know what that was, because you mentioned that, was that when the Ethics Center, we got killed, the football team got canceled. We were bad, and so Sports Illustrated put John Wesley's picture in there. This is what Methodists are up to, this unethical behavior. I'll never forget, I was here actually studying at the time. We've changed a lot since then, we've gotten there. But it's a vibrant city. We're Dallas's university, and we're proud of that. It's a great place to come study, whether it's systematic theology, whether it's ethics, history, Bible, or practical theology. All of these are vibrant here, and we're on the move. The faculty, I think, are not only into subject mastery, but also to the formation of students in a broader way, which I love very much. I joked earlier this morning about how those of us who study with Ogden learn also how to think and how to talk. But there's still a lot of truth to that here in the sense that students are gaining more than just knowledge. They're also learning how to be in the world through our faculty. Any of you study with Ogden, do you remember his blue felt tip pens? You may not, I don't know. I mean, you remember this? I mean, up and down the columns, and he always used blue felt tip pens. And I asked him about that. He had a cigar box full of them on his desk. And I asked him about that one time, and he said, I don't want to think about what pen I'm going to use. I just always use the same kind. I keep a bunch of them around so I have to go looking for them. And he gave me this advice. He said, so routinize your life that you don't have to think about the small things so that you can always have time to think about the big things. And having the same color pen was part of that for him. I don't know what's him. We're thankful that you visited SMU today, and I hope that you catch a little bit about our spirit here. We want you always to feel welcome if you're ever in the area to come back and visit. Thanks, and thanks for letting us co-sponsor this conference.
Thank you, Dean Stone. Our fourth and final co-sponsor is Bridwell Library and Press. Bridwell Library and Press has invested significant resources, both financial and otherwise, in this conference. And I repeat that without the guidance and assistance of its operations manager, Ms. Reed, and the gentleman whom I am about to introduce, this conference simply would not have been possible. Mr. Anthony Elia, who I previously referenced as a member of the Conference Planning Committee, is the director of Bridwell Library and the J.S. Bridwell Foundation Endowed Librarian, as well as the Associate Dean of Special Collections and Academic Publishing for SMU Libraries. He has graduate degrees from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, the University of Chicago, UIUC in Illinois, and Indiana University. During his relatively brief tenure as Bridwell's director, Mr. Elliott not only has aimed to cultivate conversation partners through library programming and to extend Bridwell's outreach to a broader community in order to enhance communal learning and scholarship, but also has resurrected publishing at SMU in the form of Bridwell Press to help effect such an aim. But Mr. Elliott can tell you more and better about this than I, and so Anthony.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Let me also thank Alex and Theo again for the idea of this conference to happen and all those who've made this come together. I just want to share a few quick reflections on how the growth and undertaking has evolved my thinking about what we're doing here at Bridwell Library, how we engage the world, and how the establishment of a new academic press has afforded extraordinary opportunities to understand the theme of freedom, for example, as demonstrated in the conference of part of the Ogden Gamwell legacy. So quickly, I knew Chris Gamwell only superficially, I'd say, through the University of Chicago when I was a student there 25 years ago and took a class on Niebuhr. And I'd come out to know about Ogden. I didn't know Ogden, but I got to know more about Ogden through my colleagues here at Perkins. While the Ogden cookbook, Food for the Soul, was one of our first forays into the publishing endeavor here at Bridwell in 2022, the subsequent growth and success of the press has given me pause and humility to recognize what we have accomplished and what more we have ahead of us. Working with no fewer than 50 scholars, designers, copy editors, proofreaders, layout specialists, managers, coordinators, contractors, translators, and yes, even cartographers, we have entered a new phase of publishing that has circled the globe and to some extent broken the mold of corporate academic publishing. In the last few months, when meeting with some of our scholarly series acquisitions boards, of which we have almost 15, some of the members have said to me more than once, quote, "You might put a 340-year-old publisher like Brill out of business because of your model of inclusion, open access, affordability, and deep commitment to the underrepresented works of people around the world." Now, that kind of comment is not something that I take lightly. I've been willing to engage with many scholars, different backgrounds and cultures, where the notion of freedom is nuanced and real and may mean the difference between the freedom to say what you want at home but not in public, the freedom to walk on the streets without fear of being detained, or the freedom to speak about theology without losing your job. Now, these are very different notions of freedom, which I'm sure we could debate all day. The global voices that we have around the world now, we are finding are very much alive with the questions about and the nuances of freedom. In 2020, just 5 years ago, hours before I was set to fly to Kazan, Russia, to deliver a series of lectures, the COVID epidemic closed everything around us, including our ability to travel outside the United States. And I deeply regretted that I could not deliver those talks, in part because it was the first time in my career that my speeches were censored paragraph by paragraph for a crowd of 400 local scholars and students, because freedom of speech and freedom of content and context within a tense, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multi-political state are distinct operations of the liberated mind. And I wanted to see what that really looked like on the ground in Russia. 5 years later now, I sit with dozens of manuscripts and am in constant dialogue with scholars, writers, translators, and journalists, having a conversation about the spectrum of freedom around the world and its purpose, and then what Bridwell Press can do. Among the projects we have sought out, listened to, and brought under our imprint are titles by minoritized ethnic anthropologists in East Asia that Ivy League presses shun for fear of retaliation from that greater sphere of influence, surprisingly, but it's true. Works by writers and scholars whose writings are seen as too adventurous for the strict models of tenure and promotion, but will likely change the trajectory of scholarly discourse. Works championed by a committee of scholars who will translate a dozen medieval Japanese novels, which have lain in the shadows of the great tale of Genji for 1,000 years, which will rewrite the undergraduate teaching experience of Japanese literature around the world and open doors for newly accessible texts. In Central Asia and Oxford, we've met with journalists and faculty trying to find translators to publish, translators and publishers who will take on a project of a 3,000-page prison novel smuggled out over decades to reach the English-speaking audience, but to no avail until now, because no traditional publishers will take a risk at such a massive project or think that the politics are relevant. And at Bard College, most recently, we have committed the press to preserve and translate and publish the manuscripts and lectures of Heinrich Blücher, the philosopher and husband of Hannah Arendt, one of the great minds of the 20th century, who knew and wrote more about freedom, totalitarianism, authoritarianism, evil and its banalities than just about anyone. Through his lecture series, Sources of Creative Power, Heinrich Blücher, for his part, explored how human beings can tap into their own creative capabilities to understand and establish genuine freedom. I both hope and believe that this is a major part of Bridwell's role as a publisher and our role as a community to ensure these things. Freedom and the idea of the free is something that continues to weather our souls nowadays. And revisiting writers of prior epochs and moments of conflict and seemingly end-of-days hopelessness, we might find ideas often left behind, whether on the one hand, Arendt's Human Condition or Blücher's work on creativity, or even a more controversial work like Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And on the other hand, Ogden's voluminous contributions on faith, freedom, and theology, and Gamwell's on ethical and political thought. Our reading and learning and thinking and writing must never stop. Free, I've learned, has an etymological root with the Proto-Germanic word, for those who like etymologies, the Proto-Germanic and Old English words for love, believe it or not, as in you are free when you are loved by your clan, in contrast to being in bondage by your enemy. It also has tied to Old Norse words for peace and other ancient etymological connections to the word friend and Frau in German, as in wife. Keeping that synergy of closeness together of community and love and protection within its contextual meaning. So perhaps today, as I greet you all and welcome you here, we are in the era of freedom, the freedom of having this blessed community surrounding us all, though through the spirit of Ogden and Gamwell, their students and greater scholarly family, as we are able to come together willingly and joyfully to discuss these legacies and to promote a future of greater freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Elliott. I would be remiss not also to thank Ms. Bryn Price, SMU Library's Communications and Engagement Specialist, for all her assistance in setting up and maintaining the conference blog post. We now turn to the closing portion of the lunch program, and I call again to the podium Phil to help me introduce you to the online Schubert M. Ogden Notebooks project hosted by Drew University.
Alex is going to use the technology to introduce you to to Schubert Ogden's notebooks. Now, these are writings of Schubert, about 25% of which were turned into a book on that Schubert was of the conviction that he had not thought about something clearly unless he could write it down. I find this is true. So he wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, and he kept these notes, these notebooks, in paper form, as we did in the old days. And then he gradually evolved into using a computer. And so he started to put these notes on the computer, and then to return to them, to revise them, to return to them, revise them, and revise them, and revise them. And so back in the 1970s, I and others bugged Schubert that we knew of these things, because when we would ask him a question, he would say, "Oh, I have something about this," and he would give us one of these notes. And it turned out that they were always the answer to your questions and a way to find a better way to ask those questions. And so then more of us became interested in this project, and we got in the early stages of scanning technology, we scanned the typed notebooks onto the computer, and then some of which was in German. The early days, you couldn't scan the German or along with the English. It was awful, but we persevered. How are you doing, Alex? Getting ready there? Okay. Well, I'm okay. Keep blabbing away here. If I'm not going to, but and eventually, Andrew Scrimger, who was the head librarian at Drew University, made arrangements for Schubert's works to be archived at Drew University, including these notebooks. And so they're now on a website, which Alex is going to show us how to use. And there are, these notebooks range from a paragraph to 15, 20 pages. And so there are, as we'll see, there are 1,960 entries among these of these notebooks. And amazingly enough, they're on a wide range of subjects, and they're even searchable by word or phrase. So if you want to know what Schubert thought about John Wesley, as Alex is going to show us, you type in John Wesley, and the 47 times that Schubert said something about John Wesley are within these 1,960 entries. Or the Apostle Paul, there'd be 47 exegeses of Pauline texts that Schubert did, or God 100,000 times. Or now, so here we have what the website at Drew looks like. So, section, can we now
Yes.
move it along?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
So, for example, section 1 on theology, there are 114 different entries. Debriefing after writing my paper for the Potthoff group. Schubert went over what he said there and improved it. What am I doing in arguing theologically? Success and failure. it goes on and on and on. And so that's the first section on theology. And scroll it up, Alex, okay?
Okay.
And so there are 114 there on religion, 40 entries on religion. Cantwell Smith. Well, and on it goes. On authority. Can you pull up 348?
Sure.
Or was it 438? Mm-hmm. This is an interest.
Oh, the one that you asked me to do before?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was 438.
438.
Yeah.
And then click on it. In what sense is it true that God is absent from modern science? Well, he asked himself the question. Bernard Lonergan was a famous Canadian Jesuit philosopher, theologian. According to Lonergan, this statement is true in the sense that the divine is not a datum to be observed by sense or to be uncovered by introspection. Sort of Rawlsian. But against such a view, I would argue first that by this reasoning, God could never have been present in any science, modern or otherwise. And second, that it contradicts the essential claim of theism as to the ubiquity of the divine. A God who is not presented somehow in all experience is precisely no God at all. Dan? I mean, Brett, I'm sorry. The alternative view, which affirms the same statement, albeit in a different sense, that modern science, by its very method, abstracts from that aspect or dimension of experience in which God is a datum, however dimly given, which I was talking about this morning. In other words, the absence of God from modern science is not so much because God is who God is, because modern science is what modern science is, or what Rawls thinks politics is. It seems to be that's about the gist of it, okay? And he wrote this in 1971, and you can see, which he recorded, and he revised it 22 August 2003. The entries in the notebook started in 1971 and continued to 2010, because I went back and checked through the search engine when they started and when they finished. And so we have 40 years of Schubert's thinking about everything he thought about, right, as he himself thought about it and wrote about it. And it's amazing. It is truly amazing. And it's a tremendous resource. And I don't mean just for thinking about how Schubert's thought evolved. Who cares about that? Because Schubert didn't care about that. He wanted to always find out what's true. That was the only question he cared about. Same with Chris. So, but if you want to know what Schubert thought was true about something, this is a great place to look. And the search thing makes it so easy. You just, whatever you're interested in, pop the word in, ta-da.
Let me show you a little bit about that.
Alex
okay?
will show you.
So first, to access the site, the easiest thing to do is to go on Google or a web browser and just type in Ogden notebooks. That's all you need to do. On some web browsers, if you type in Schubert M Ogden notebooks, that will work. But the problem is that it may also take you to a site that is defunct and no longer is functioning. So the easiest thing to do is type in Ogden notebooks. The other thing you can do is you can go to the Drew University site itself. And on the Drew University site, in the search bar, you would type in Drew University Special Collections. So do that
just
here.
go to Ogden Notebooks.
Well, I want to show them.
He's just going to show you what not to do. Alex, forget it. Just Ogden Notebooks.
No, I know, but I wanted to. I was told to do this, so I
know you were, but I'm telling you something different.
Yes,
Ogden
I know.
Notebooks.
I know, but anyway, so in any event, okay, so we'll just stick with the Ogden notebooks. And as Phil said, the notebook's home is at the top, and if you click on that, you come to the search bar, okay? Now, when you type in a term, please make sure to type it in using quotes. So for instance, if we did knowledge of God, you would want to make sure that it's in quotation marks. The reason is because if you don't, if you write knowledge of God as is, you'll get search terms for knowledge, and then you get search terms for God, and you might get search terms for synonyms for knowledge and synonyms for God. But if you use the quotation marks, knowledge of God, you will get that phrase and that phrase exactly. You will see a pop-up box come up, and it will give you, as it does here, the two major notebooks where this is a theme, notebooks 439 and 1060. Sometimes you will see this mark, this, it's like a PDF form. These notebooks were converted, scanned from PDF forms. You don't want to fool with those or mess with those, so you just want to stay on the actual notebook numbers themselves. So we go to the second one, Ogden Notebooks 1060, Luther on the Double Knowledge of God. What comes up is something very much like we saw before with 436. Again, you have the notebook entry, and then at the bottom it has the first date of entry. In this case, it was June 4th, 1974, and it was revised almost 30 years later. Okay, so just shows you how Schubert kept up with his work and tried to revise and constantly revise it. As Phil said, the notebooks are divided into 57 broad categories. And I should mention here, I don't know if you did, Phil, I'm sorry, I was occupied trying to get the computer working. This notebook that was printed basically deals with philosophical theology and metaphysics and the topic of God. And Schubert spent some considerable time organizing that, trying to get it in coherent form and fashion. That consists of 118 notebooks, or notes, I should say. The entire notebook project consists of 1,960 notes. So you can imagine if that's 118, how large a file that we're talking about. So it is quite an achievement, and we encourage you, invite you to explore it, experiment with it, and to be edified by it. So.
Great.
Thank you. Okay, just bear with me 1 second here. That should go. Okay. Okay, how are we doing time? Actually, it's 2:05, and the next program is not to begin until 2:15. So you have 10 minutes. Please help yourself. Yes, go ahead.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to just take the mic here. I wrote everything I said this morning in a poem, and it's going to take me about 5 minutes to read it to you. You can leave if you like. Nothing rhymes with Ogden, and Gamwell's just as bad, but still their kind of thinking is the best we've ever had. where best means simply honest, no special pleading here, and true means you can understand it, no appeal to faith, to fear, nor confusing true with Christian, though what's Christian may be true, yet only if it makes experiential sense to me and you. But what's genuinely Christian, and why is that the case? Not because the church declares it, nor in the Bible has a place. This too is fairly simple. If from Jesus it should stem, it brings what his disciples tell us he had meant to them. How he changed their lives completely, turned them inside out. That's the point of Christian. That's what Christianity is about. A certain kind of impact, basic and profound. A different, better set of values to live one's life around. Where treasure isn't money and appearances are dross. God, now your loving parent, not your all-powerful boss. Sending sun and rain on enemy and not alone on friend, expecting much the same from you, no matter what the end. So love from love, not hate from hate, nor prudent tit for tat. If this is what it comes to, what shall we say of that? If this is what is Christian still, why should we think it's true? Well, it's back to that experiential sense for me and you. To that and to the logic of the matter now at hand, which our friends with the unifying, unrhyming names have helped us understand. Tell me nothing really matters. I will tell you something does, and that something's that you told me this. And this is just because you took it quite for granted that it did when you just said it. And for this to be true, there must be something that can credit what you think is doubtful only functions to confirm that for this something you are missing, God's the logical term. That's the word that stands for what is ultimately good and that gives its proper meaning to the truly moral should, which is different from a must, just as also from a may. So that if we say God wills it, what we really mean to say is not that it's accomplished, but that it is ultimately good and therefore what's to be accomplished, just because it should. So it's value that is basic, and the good is what's divine, and if we keep our focus, we will let this good define everything we say and why, and just precisely what we mean when we speak of God, dismissing all the pomp and sheen of sheer will, awesome dread, or holy might, and turn instead to pure, unbounded love to get it right. It turns out God's dipolar, since that's what love is too, doing good to others, accepting good and evil unto you, taking it all in, and returning good for bad. Perfect in both measures, even if such radical procedure contradicts established norms and points to new and often controversial forms. Love, not law enforced by a threat, nor even mercy, for that is justice but foregone, and nothing could be more confused than to equate God's role with ours and take justice to belong to God when equity's our stake, to share the scarce resources of this finite earthly place when abundance is the hallmark of God's all-inclusive grace. The legacy of our unrhyming colleagues should be clear, at least for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, excluding not a single soul of conscience all possessed, and by such conscience each and all can only be blessed through being grasped by perfect love, which none can fully flee, to give up grasping love in turn, and freeing be made free.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. So, so we'll meet back here at 2:15. There is still food outside and something to drink. We also have some copies available of Food for the Soul, so if you haven't picked one up, they should be on the table out there. Okay, we'll meet back at 2:15. Thank you. The topic of this third and final session is Ogden's and Gamwell's philosophy of religion for a democracy, making sense of religious pluralism, is there only one true religion or are there many, and of religious freedom, the meaning of religious freedom. We are very pleased to have as our session speaker Dr. William J. Meyer, Professor of Philosophy in the Ralph W. Beeson Professor of Religion, Maryville College. Best known for his monumental work, Metaphysics and the Future of Theology, the Voice of Theology in Public Life, Dr. Meyer is chosen for the title of his presentation today, Completing Modernity, Franklin Gamwell and Schubert Ogden on Religious Freedom, Religious Pluralism, and the Way of Reason. Responses to his paper will be given by Dr. Daniel Arnold, the John Henry Barrows Professor in the University of Chicago Divinity School and in the college, as well as affiliated faculty in the departments of philosophy and of South Asian languages and civilizations, and by the Reverend Dr. Marie Olson Purcell, Assistant Teaching Professor in SMU's Department of Religious Studies, and a 2022 PhD graduate in Religion and Culture in the GPRS. Like our prior two sessions, once the responses have been provided, our speaker and respondents will engage in conversation in front here, after which we will open the discussion to the audience for questions and brief comments. And so without further ado, Dr. Meyer.
I can't promise either a Devonish poem or holy play, but I'll try to give you clarity and reflection in the spirit of Ogden and Gamwell. Thank you, Alex, and to all of our gracious hosts here at SMU. The trajectory of modernity, one might suggest, was summed up in two famous statements by Immanuel Kant. The first was, sapere aude, dare to know. Have courage to use your own reason. That is the motto of enlightenment. The second was, I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. The first of these statements encapsulates what might be called modernity's formal commitment to reason, rather than reliance on authority, is the means by which to assess and validate claims. This call to reason is a call to autonomy instead of heteronomy, a call to self-governance rather than to be ruled by another. The second statement encapsulates modernity's widespread substantive conclusion that this call to reason has limits, namely that knowledge of reality as such is beyond the limits of reason, and therefore that modern thought must be post-metaphysical. This twofold combination has created a tension within modernity, namely that its commitment to reason putatively cannot address life's most comprehensive questions regarding the nature of existence as such, and by implication, its meaning. In light of this tension, public life has tended to be left with two options: either to impose some form of establishment regarding comprehensive convictions, or to privatize them and treat them like a personal hobby. These two options, however, are both problematic. Establishment leads to imposition and heteronomy, while privatization leads to triviality, treating ultimate convictions as if they were inessential. In response to this situation, Franklin Gamwell and Schubert Ogden devoted much of their intellectual efforts to resolving this tension by offering a better alternative. Gamwell refers to this third option as the way of reason, and more specifically and variously as politics by the way of reason, democracy in the way of reason, and faith in the way of reason. Briefly stated, this third option involves fully affirming modernity's formal commitment to reason, while concomitantly challenging its substantive presumption that comprehensive questions are super-rational. Within the limits of this paper, I will first set forth Gamwell's conception of religious freedom, and then show how Ogden addresses religious pluralism. In his 1995 book, The Meaning of Religious Freedom, Modern Politics and the Democratic Resolution, Gamwell seeks to offer a coherent philosophical conception of freedom of thought within the context of a pluralistic modern democracy. In brief, how does one combine self-governance and freedom of comprehensive convictions without government establishment? This conceptual question, which Brett referred to before, is what Gamwell calls the modern political problematic. Though his primary aim is indeed philosophical rather than legal or historical, Gamwell occasionally draws upon these other fields as he seeks to illuminate and constructively resolve the modern political problematic. For instance, he draws upon the work of the historian Sidney Mead, who describes the founding of the American Republic as the lively experiment. Prior to the American constitutional order, the prevailing assumption in political theory was that religious establishment was essential because the stability of the social order required some underlying agreement on the comprehensive question, even if some degree of religious toleration was permitted within this wider establishment. In contrast, the American constitutional order, as embodied in the First Amendment, with its combination of disestablishment and religious freedom, offered a novel and lively experiment, namely a body politic founded on freedom of comprehensive convictions. The underlying source of this lively experiment, Mead argues, were the Enlightenment rationalists and deists among the American founders. As Gamwell reports, it is Mead's conviction that a coherent understanding of religious freedom was present only in the minds of a relative minority of its supporters, whom Mead calls rationalists, and for whom he takes Jefferson, Madison, and Franklin to be the principal voices. These rationalists were convinced, Gamwell continues, that the body politic is perfected insofar as people are guided by reason. With respect to the political process, this conviction implied that opportunities for full and free rational discussion and debate should be provided and protected. The errors or prejudices of irrational claims could be disclosed by the light of criticism, and the truth could be approached by common reflection. This select group of founders, one might say, pointed in the right direction for resolving the modern political problematic. Their rationalism embraced modernity's formal commitment to reason and autonomy, rather than authority and heteronomy, while their deism challenged modernity's post-metaphysical presumption by maintaining that comprehensive convictions, at least deistic ones, could be rationally discerned and validated. Along these lines, Gamwell, quoting Mead, states, "Rationalism fostered the idea of individual human autonomy guided by the light of nature and nature's God through reason." Though Gamwell critiques Mead's resolution of the political problematic as still being too narrow, as leading to something like a deistic civil religion, he nevertheless thinks that Mead helpfully points in the right direction. What is needed now is to pursue this direction more fully and coherently, which is precisely what Gamwell seeks to do. In terms of its structure, Gamwell's proposal employs three key distinctions. First, the difference between what is formal or procedural versus what is substantive. Second, Ogden's distinction between what is constitutive versus what is representative. And third, the difference between what is implicit versus what is explicit. In outlining Gamwell's position, I will address each of these in turn. As defined by religious freedom, Gamwell observes, quote, democracy is a political expression of the Enlightenment affirmation that the truth about human life and the world is accessible to reason, and therefore that all human understandings are properly assessed only by appeal to human experience and reason, or by argument. The democratic resolution, then, means that no politically relevant claim can be redeemed by appeal to the fact that some individual, community of individuals, or tradition makes the claim. The commitment to human experience and reason is the denial of every such authoritarian affirmation. In sum, democracy expresses politically the affirmation that free argument and debate are finally the only natural weapon of truth. End quote. In this extended passage, Gamwell contends that the very meaning of democracy and religious freedom are rooted in modernity's formal commitment to reason and human experience, rather than to authority, is the procedural means by which any claim can be publicly validated. This formal commitment can and must apply to all public claims, including comprehensive ones. If I understand Gamwell's position correctly, one must not only embrace modernity's formal commitment, but one must also reject its substantive post-metaphysical presumption. As he puts it, the affirmation that comprehensive convictions can be assessed by appeal to human experience and reason is clearly a necessary condition for commitment to full and free political discourse. Any participant who rejects this condition cannot authentically entertain criticism of her or his claims or assess the claims of others. And absent the possibility of entertaining and advancing criticism, authentic discussion and debate is impossible. To prescribe religious freedom, then, is to prescribe that all citizens accept the Enlightenment affirmation, or what we may also call the way of reason. Gamwell's point here applies not only to those religious adherents who are inclined to elevate revelation above reason, but also to those philosophers and others who are inclined to presume that metaphysical claims are beyond the limits of rational public assessment. Hence, Gamwell declares that the state's duty to guarantee the teaching of religious freedom includes teaching not only the negative prescription that the state may not explicitly answer the comprehensive question, but also the positive prescription that the political association with its plurality of legitimate religions is constituted by a commitment to the way of reason. So in essence, religious freedom entails at least three key elements. 1, government disestablishment. 2, freedom of comprehensive convictions. And 3, a shared common commitment to rational discourse for all public claims, including comprehensive ones. In a later follow-up essay, Gamwell spells out in further detail how he envisions the rational assessment of comprehensive claims. On this proposal, he states, warrant for the true answer includes thoroughly common human experience. Although what is common to human experience may be understood only implicitly or inchoately, so that it may also be misinterpreted or denied. Thereby, all humans have a common basis for assessment of comprehensive convictions by public reason. In a detailed footnote in that same essay, Gamwell explains what he means by common human experience. There are, he suggests, two distinct meanings of this phrase, one of which I will call the empirical and the other the transcendental. In empirical terms, common human experience refers to that which is commonplace among human beings, such as seeing the sun on a beautiful day in Dallas, rather than those experiences that are more esoteric or private, such as a personal mystical experience. Because common empirical experiences have been widely encountered by many, we have good reason to accept their veracity, whereas those that are more esoteric lack this common credibility. As I read Gamwell, he does not deny the value of this empirical meaning, for it is rightly part of the data of modern public discourse. Rather, the problem is that this empirical meaning is neither adequate nor sufficient to address the validity claims of comprehensive convictions. For this more demanding task, one needs to understand common human experience in a transcendental sense. That is, in such a way that is necessarily included in any possible experience. Hence, Gamwell writes as follows: common human experience does not mean a separate experience that occurs at some time or another in all or nearly all human lives, but rather an experience that occurs whenever anything else is experienced. What is common is, in Reinhold Niebuhr's metaphor, he continues, an overtone in all experience. That such common experience is human means that all human activities are implicitly aware of it or understand it. As Niebuhr writes, it impinges upon a soul which reaches the outermost rims of its own consciousness. Strictly speaking, says Gamwell, I intend what is at least implicitly understood by all humans who understand themselves as individuals. That is, those aspects understood at least inchoately whenever anything is understood. For instance, that the activity is aware of itself, with others, within the all-inclusive whole. On my belief, adds Gamwell, this includes a telos by which any decision with understanding is directed, and that becomes a moral law when a human life understands itself as an individual is included within common human experience. One can see here that Gamwell seeks to broaden modernity's conception of public reason, of what kind of grounds can and must be included within public discourse. And it is only within this wider conception that religious freedom makes coherent sense. To be clear, he maintains that all comprehensive convictions are civically and constitutionally legitimate. People are free to hold whatever comprehensive doctrine or evaluative principle that they are inclined to. But in the context of public discourse, they must then be prepared rationally to defend and validate their claims. And the transcendental conditions provide a common ground by which public discourse can assess these various claims. Such comprehensive claims, he states, answer a rational question because they assert for humans differing explications of the encompassing truth about self-conscious life, including its proper commitment or orientation in practice that all humans implicitly understand. It is at this juncture that Gamwell's second key distinction becomes apparent, namely between that which is constitutive and that which is representative. As explications, Gamwell continues, The convictions religious freedom protects are for humans putative representations of this encompassing truth. Each seeks to present again the ultimate terms of evaluation and their authorizing ground that are implicitly present to all people. And any such representation claims to be important as an aid consistent with human authenticity. So the encompassing truth, Gamwell suggests, if I understand him correctly, is constituted by the underlying and necessary characteristics of existence as such. But this constitutive ground can potentially be validly represented in one or more explications. And it is precisely the essential task of public discourse to assess their putative meaning and validity. Put simply, free and full public discourse is needed in order gradually to discern the truth about reality as such, and consequently, about the comprehensive evaluative principle for validly assessing all alternatives, including political ones. This rational and comprehensive conception of religious freedom, Gamwell insists, is essential if democracy is understood in terms of popular sovereignty. As he remarks, quote, "We the people can be the final ruling power only if each citizen is sovereign over her or his evaluation of every political claim. That is, she or he is free from any governmental stipulation with respect to political evaluation." Think of Jimmy Kimmel in these past few weeks. Accordingly, Gamwell continues, each citizen must be free to endorse and advocate any ultimate terms of evaluation and their authorization she or he finds convincing, and thereby must be sovereign over her or his comprehensive conviction. All such convictions must be insofar legitimate. Alternatively, and this is back to what Rebecca so insightfully said before lunch. Listen to this, what Gamwell says. Alternatively, if comprehensive claims cannot be assessed by public reason, as modernity has tended to assume, I'm sorry, this is me, not him, then, quote, popular sovereignty is impossible. If political contention at the most fundamental level of evaluation is immune to reasoned adjudication, Gamwell observes, then conflict based on that disagreement cannot be civilized, since there is nothing more fundamental to which common appeal might be made. End quote. All that is left, he notes, is either at best a modus vivendi or at worst force, coercion, and violence. In contrast, democracy, constituted by the way of reason, enables each citizen to unite as equals in a full and free political discourse. Finally, the third key distinction that Gamwell employs is that between convictions that are implicit in the activities of the state and the state's explicit prescriptions. In order for religious freedom to be coherent, and thereby all comprehensive convictions to be constitutionally legitimate, the state can never explicitly prescribe or proscribe any comprehensive principle of evaluation. The common metaphor of a wall of separation, Gamwell would suggest, is a misnomer because, as we have seen, the whole point of religious freedom is to enable genuine and active public engagement with comprehensive convictions. Rather, the proper conception is one of explicit state neutrality regarding all comprehensive doctrines. For instance, he would say that the original Pledge of Allegiance was better when it simply declared one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, rather than the later redacted version of the Eisenhower Cold War era, which added the phrase, under God. Such explicit theistic affirmations, Gamwell insists, have no proper place within state declarations. Indeed, the whole point of constitutional language, as Brett referred to before lunch, is to set forth and ensure the procedural conditions that enable all citizens to freely and fully participate in public political discourse. Therefore, the state can never take explicit sides when it comes to comprehensive convictions and comprehensive questions, contrary to what Christian nationalists are seeking to bring about in America today. If the state must always remain explicitly neutral regarding comprehensive convictions, this does not mean that such convictions cannot and do not implicitly influence the life of the body politic. For as Gamwell puts it, since the character of human authenticity as such is presupposed by all human activity, it follows that all human activity, and therefore the activities of the state, implicitly affirms some answer to the comprehensive question. This is what substantive public debates are all about, namely, what is the good or telos that we should seek in our individual and collective lives? As I understand Gamwell's position, he envisions a robust civil society as an essential part of democracy. Civil society is that key middle space between the private sphere of family and friends on one end and the state on the other. Civil society consists of that broad and essential collection of independent forms of association, such as clubs, churches, civic organizations, colleges, etc. I think it is noteworthy that, from what I've heard in the past day or two, that the president of the University of Texas, Austin, has now come to be president of SMU. He's going from a public institution that's receiving explicit pressure to a private institution where at least has a little bit more latitude. It is within civil society that explicit and robust public debates about comprehensive questions should occur. The point of having free and full rational discourse about any question is to seek to discern the truth. Hence, whatever comprehensive conclusions generate and achieve a rational public consensus can implicitly inform a democratic society's laws and collective efforts toward affirming life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The laws themselves can never explicitly prescribe or proscribe any particular comprehensive doctrine, but the laws can be implicitly informed by those comprehensive convictions that generate a public consensus. So overall, Franklin Gamwell shows us what a coherent conception of religious freedom entails within a democratic society, namely one defined by the way of reason. Likewise, Schubert Ogden seeks to exemplify what this way of reason entails regarding religious pluralism, to which I now turn. In his 1992 book, Is There One True Religion or Are There Many? Ogden seeks to delineate the nature of religious truth claims and outline the logical alternatives among them. At the heart of any religion or comprehensive doctrine, Ogden holds, is the task of explicitly asking and answering the existential question of the meaning of ultimate reality for us. This inescapable question, he suggests, stems from the transcendental character of human existence, and relatedly, from our basic human faith. Let me elucidate these related elements. The transcendental character of human existence stems from the nature of existence with understanding, which is the source of our distinctive freedom and responsibility. As Ogden declares, at the root of this responsibility is the distinctive freedom that is ours in consequence of our capacity for understanding both ourselves and others, and the encompassing whole of reality of which we're all parts. From this capacity, he reflects, we acquire the ability to ask the existential question of how we are to understand ourselves and others in relation to the whole, if ours is to be an authentic human existence. Ogden immediately continues, quote, underlying this existential question as its basic supposition is the faith that there is such an authentic self-understanding, that the ultimate reality of one's own existence together with others in the whole is such that some way of understanding oneself is uniquely appropriate or authorized, and that one both can and should understand oneself accordingly. I speak of this faith as basic faith in the meaning of life, and on my analysis, he continues, it is a necessary condition of the possibility of all of our self-understanding and praxis. Literally everything we think, say, or do, insofar at least as it makes or implies a claim to validity, necessarily presupposes that ultimate reality is such as to authorize some understanding of ourselves as authentic, and that conversely, some understanding of existence is authentic because it is authorized by ultimate reality, end quote. One sees here in this extended passage Ogden expositing the Anselmian theme of faith-seeking understanding by way of reason, rather than by way of authority, tradition, or super-rational belief. Given our inescapable capacity of understanding ourselves in relation to others and the all-inclusive whole, all humans have a deep-seated, indeed necessary, existential trust or faith that there is a right, fitting, or appropriate way to live in harmony with the character of reality, with the character of ultimate reality. As illustrated by this passage, Ogden is fond of using the term authorized. And I, for one, have usually found that term less than clear or helpful. Chris uses it too, of course. But I must admit that in this context, I begin to understand Ogden's usage more clearly. Namely, there is indeed some ultimate character of reality, whatever it is, and thus there is some true or authentic way of understanding and living in relation to reality, and consequently, that the meaning of existence is to live in harmony with this ultimate character. So reality, one can say, authorizes this understanding, meaning, and way of living as authentic, as in harmony with the grain of reality as such. As Ogden makes clear, the fact that we as humans cannot avoid asking and answering the existential question does not suffice to ensure that we do so, either adequately or accurately. Indeed, for just as the basic supposition of science presupposes that the world has some kind of order, does not in and of itself suffice to tell us how the world is in fact ordered, so too, Ogden observes, how we are to understand ourselves, if we are to do so authentically, remains an open question, even with the confidence that there is and must be an answer to it. Summarily stated then, faith-seeking understanding entails our basic existential trust, seeking rational understanding of authentic existence in relation to the character of reality as such. We can now see that different comprehensive convictions are thus different proposed answers to the existential question of the meaning of ultimate reality for us. As Ogden writes, quote, Thus, whether or not a particular cultural system allows for thinking and speaking of human existence in terms of God or emptiness, the one or the true self, it is properly understood as a religion, provided only that it is the primary form of culture through which persons living in some social group are given to explicitly ask and answer the existential question. This means that even so-called secular understandings of existence that satisfy this same condition may be forthrightly designated as religions. It further implies that the number of at least potential candidates for the title of true religion is considerably larger than might well be supposed, end quote. So the assertion of being the true religion Ogden denotes is the claim to decisive existential authority. By this, I take him to mean the claim to offer the true or authentic understanding of the meaning of existence in relation to the character of reality as such. And in this sense, he continues, every religion at least implicitly claims to be the true religion. From here, he proceeds to make an important nuanced distinction between claiming to be formally true versus claiming to be substantially true. As he explains it, what it means to claim to be the true religion is the claim to be formally and not merely substantially true. In other words, it belongs to a religion to claim to be the true religion and hence the formal norm by which all other true religion, if any, has to be determined. What Ogden means by formal norm is the standard or yardstick by which all other alternatives must be evaluated. And this makes sense if one thinks about it, for what it means to be a Christian or a Buddhist or a Marxist, etc., is to be convinced that that particular comprehensive understanding, whatever it is, accurately and decisively answers the existential question. Hence, any other competing comprehensive doctrine that claims to be true must measure up in terms of this formal standard. Put simply, it must say something substantially the same, even if it says it in a different idiom. Ogden continues to further unpack what is entailed by claiming to be formally true. The existential question of the meaning of existence presupposes and is closely tied to two other distinct but related questions, namely the metaphysical and the ethical. This threefold structure, existential, metaphysical, ethical, is important, Ogden maintains, because it delineates the appropriate rational grounds for assessing the truth of religious claims. In essence, religious truth claims assert that they adequately and coherently make sense of our basic faith in the meaning of life. Whether any given religious or comprehensive conviction can do this, Ogden observes, can be determined only by verifying its necessary implications, ethical as well as metaphysical. If it is true, its implications also must be true. One can see here Ogden's clear and thorough commitment to the way of reason for all validity claims, including metaphysical ones. For religious truth claims are indeed cognitive claims that need to be validated in rational public discourse, just like any other claim. To sum up then, says Ogden, the term true religion refers to one or more specific religions whose claim to be formally true, and hence the norm for determining all other true religions, is a valid claim, as determined by the procedures of verification that have just been indicated. If I understand Ogden correctly, there are two distinct steps involved here. First, one must test and validate a given religion's claim to truth by appropriately assessing and validating its metaphysical, existential, and ethical claims. And then second, one can then discern whether other religions may also be formally true. For two or more religions can indeed be formally true if their respective metaphysical, existential, and ethical claims come to basically the same conclusions, even if they are semantically stated in different ways. Engaging in this demanding task of determining whether two or more different religions are in fact saying the same thing is the challenging but important work of interreligious dialogue. Ogden himself participated in such dialogue over many years as part of an international Buddhist Christian discussion group. In addressing his overarching question of whether there is only one true religion or are there many, Ogden then proceeds to lucidly analyze and set forth the logical alternatives. The first alternative is what he calls monism, the claim that there is only one formally true religion because there can be only one formally true religion. Underlying this monistic view, he seems to suggest, is the presumption that the one true religion constitutes the relation of human existence to the character of ultimate reality. For instance, within Christian monism, there are two distinct forms, exclusivism and inclusivism. Common to both monistic positions, Ogden remarks, is the claim that there not only is but can be only one true religion because Christianity alone can validly claim to be formally true. The underlying assumption here is that Christ constitutes the relation of humanity to reality as such. For the exclusivist, one must therefore explicitly know and confess Christ in order to participate in the true religion and gain salvation. Ogden quotes the Latin church father Cyprian to illustrate this position. Extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside of the church, there is no salvation. In contrast, the inclusivist contends that the salvific work of Christ can and does operate implicitly in and through other religions and comprehensive outlooks. According to this answer, says Ogden, the possibility of salvation uniquely constituted by the event of Jesus Christ is somehow made available to each and every human being without exception, and therefore is exclusive of no one unless she or he excludes her or himself from its effect by a free and responsible decision to reject it. Back to the freedom of the will of this morning, I suppose. In this case, he adds, there's also the possibility of all religions being more or less substantially true, insofar as this salvation becomes effective in human beings. To illustrate this inclusivist view, Ogden points to the example of Karl Rahner's notion of anonymous Christians. But what the inclusivist ultimately shares with the exclusivist, Ogden notes, is precisely their underlying constitutive view, which monistically entails that there can be only one formally true religion. To be sure, Ogden thinks inclusivism is better than exclusivism, but their shared underlying problem of monism remains, which is rooted in their mistaken, indeed misguided constitutive view. More on this below. The commonly asserted alternative to monism is pluralism, which claims that there are many formally true religions. Pointing to John Hick as an example, Ogden states, quote, the assertion typical of pluralism is that Christianity is not the only true religion, but in John Hick's words, one of a plurality of contexts of salvation within which the transformation of human existence from self-centeredness to God or reality-centeredness is occurring. Such an assertion, Hick claims, is the logical or natural conclusion of the trajectory whose path can be traced from an exclusivist to an inclusivist view of other religions, end quote. In essence, Hick seems to suggest that the pluralistic conclusion that there are many equally true religions is the logical outcome of the historical trend from exclusivism to inclusivism and then on to pluralism. But in coming to this conclusion, pluralism makes an unwarranted logical leap. For to counter monism, Ogden observes, in no way requires one to assert with pluralism that there actually are many ways of salvation, of which Christianity is but one. All that one needs is to assert that there can be these many ways, even if, as a matter of fact, Christianity should turn out to be the only way of salvation there is. In other words, the logical alternative to the monistic claim is not to jump all the way to the empirical claim that there are, in fact, many true religions. This is a premature and thus unwarranted step. Rather, the logical alternative is merely that there can be more than one true religion. For this reason, Ogden continues, Hick's claim is unfounded. Pluralism is not the logical conclusion of a consistent movement away from exclusivism, but rather is an independent assertion to be evaluated on its own merits. It is at this juncture that, in critiquing pluralism, that Ogden's own position comes to the fore. In moving beyond the usual options of exclusive monism, inclusive monism, and pluralism, Ogden proposes a fourth alternative, which I will call critical comparative engagement. His contention is that there can be more than one formally true religion, but whether or not there is in fact more than one is a matter that can only be patiently discerned through critical comparative engagement among different religions or comprehensive doctrines. In short, the error of pluralism is that it jumps the gun. It seeks harmony prematurely by pointing to formal similarities among different traditions, but pluralists do so without thoroughly engaging the respective validity claims of different outlooks. As Ogden declares, whether any religion at all is true must, in the nature of the case, be more or less difficult to determine, precisely because it requires undertaking the well-known difficulties of both metaphysical and ethical verification. For instance, Ogden notes that even after many years of engaging in Buddhist-Christian dialogue, he himself is still, at best, unsure whether Christians and Buddhists are saying something fundamentally similar or different about the nature of existence as such. In fact, in his own words, he confesses, quote, "I still have not been able to conclude that Buddhism and Christianity are really only different formulations of the same understanding of existence. Subtle as their real differences may be, there nonetheless seem to me to be such. And up to now, at least, I have not found any way of reducing them. This becomes particularly clear," he adds, "whenever I consider not only Buddhist and Christian self-understandings as such, but also their metaphysical implications." End quote. To be sure, Ogden acknowledges that apparent differences may be the result of given concepts and symbols in which a viewpoint happens to be formulated. But this notwithstanding, he thinks the substantive differences are still there. The fact remains, he remarks, that what are widely supposed to be the metaphysical implications of Buddhist self-understanding are really and significantly different from what I, for one, take to be necessarily implied by a Christian understanding of existence, namely the differences between Christian theism on the one hand and Buddhist non-theism on the other. If the error of pluralism is its premature consensus, then the error of monism is its constitutive outlook. In contrast to Christian monists who presume or assert that the Christ event constitutes the possibility of salvation, Ogden declares that this event in no way constitutes the possibility of salvation, but only represents it. That is to say, it serves to declare a possibility of salvation that already is present as it is prior to the events occurring to declare it. To illustrate, Ogden offers the interesting analogy of a marriage ceremony. The marriage ceremony, Ogden contends, does not constitute the marriage relation, for that relation is originated and grounded in the bond already present between two persons. Rather, the function of the marriage ceremony is to publicly proclaim and represent the marriage relation itself. Likewise, he says the same about the sacrament of baptism. The act of baptism represents God's grace. It does not constitute it. For the possibility of salvation is grounded in the everlasting character of the divine itself, namely the boundless love of God. Hence, no event in history could ever constitute the possibility of salvation. That is just a fundamentally mistaken conception. Thus, Ogden states unequivocally that the Christ event cannot be the cause of salvation, because the only cause, and the cause of this Christ event itself, is the boundless love of God, of which this event is the decisive representation. So what it means to claim that the Christian religion is formally true, Ogden concludes, is to claim that the love of God is the ultimate character of reality, with which every human being has to do as soon and as long as she or he exists humanly at all. If this is the case, then it is a necessary condition present in and for every self-understanding. Therefore, if any other religions or comprehensive doctrines are also formally true, then they too must, in some implicit or explicit way, also represent this divine love in some manner, even if it is expressed in some other semantic formulation. Ogden, of course, recognizes that to express the formal truth of religion in this manner is a specifically Christian way of explaining this possibility. But to be a Christian and to take Christianity to be the formally true religion are, he notes, one and the same thing. Likewise, he adds, every religion claims implicitly or explicitly to be formally true, and the adherents of any religion are bound to employ what it, in turn, specifies as formally normative, as exactly that in judging all claims to religious truth. For instance, he conjectures that a Buddhist must think and speak of anyone who actualizes an authentic self-understanding as a fellow Buddhist, even if only an implicit or anonymous one. In sum, one might say that Ogden's view affirms the integrity of religious outlooks that monists seek, but also affirms the genuine openness and respect that pluralists seek. And yet it is neither the one nor the other, but a distinct alternative that insists upon full and free discourse that rationally assesses all validity claims. In fact, this discourse always entails a risk that might lead one to significantly revise or reject one's own convictions. As Ogden states, quote, Christians today can frankly acknowledge that the only way in which they can continue to be Christians is to accept the possibility and risk of ceasing to be such in face of experiences and reasons that on the whole invalidate their claim instead of validating it, end quote. The same risk, of course, holds for all other outlooks as well. Hence, there can indeed be more than one formally true religion, but to discern the answer of this important question waits upon further critical comparative engagement. Conclusion. The French philosopher Paul Ricoeur referred to Jürgen Habermas as the last great Aufklärer, the last great defender of the Enlightenment. In a similar spirit, I think of Franklin Gamwell and Schubert Ogden as the great completers of modernity. By this, I mean that they not only fully embrace modernity's formal commitment to autonomy and the way of reason, but they do so by going all the way, by applying the way of reason to comprehensive convictions, including metaphysical claims. The Enlightenment project, one might say, tragically short-circuited itself by excluding the possibility of rational public discourse regarding comprehensive convictions. Kant's attempt to deny theoretical reason in order to make room for faith ultimately did neither faith nor reason genuine service. Though he was indeed right to critique the traditional approach to metaphysics, he regrettably rejected the ongoing metaphysical enterprise, namely the rational attempt to discern the character of reality as such. This post-metaphysical legacy, one might suggest, has been one factor that has gradually contributed over time to the post-rational, post-fact world of our current 21st century context. A world that cannot rationally and publicly engage comprehensive and metaphysical questions is one that eventually leads to nihilistic ennui and or to authoritarian attempts to impose a comprehensive doctrine. In such a situation, as University of Virginia sociologist James Davison Hunter observes, the authoritarian solution to the puzzle of e pluribus unum would be to impose unum by force if need be, end quote. In contrast, Gamwell and Ogden show us how democracy, freedom, reason, and faith can and should cohere. Instead of imposing an unum by force, they show us how reason can be the great preserver of sanity and civility, seeking to achieve an unum by the way of reason and discourse. For this, we are indebted to them for their valuable contributions. And in this upcoming year of the 250th anniversary of the American Republic, we are called to take up their mantle by reaffirming the way of reason in order to try to restore and further pursue the noble aim of forming a more perfect union. Thank you.
Is this on again? Yeah? Okay. By way of response to Bill's paper, I'd like to drill down a bit on into Schubert Ogden's "Is there only one true religion, or are there many?" And to that extent, what I have to say will rehearse again some of what figured in the last half of that paper. I want to do so, though, with an eye towards interrogating or problematizing one aspect of the conclusion, the very last sentence, I think it was. Instead of imposing an unum by force, Gamwell and Ogden show us how reason can be the great preserver of sanity and civility. And it seems to me there are a couple different ways that they show us how that could be understood. It could be understood as a matter of theory or in principle, in which case I have no qualms with the claim, or it could be understood as a claim that, as they show us, a way that is empirically likely to be successful. And I have serious misgivings about that, and I want to bring into view some of the reasons for that. So Schubert Ogden's book, "Is There Only One True Religion, or Are There Many?" has been familiar to me for a long time. It was one of the things I read in my doctoral qualifying exams for the Philosophy of Religions program at the University of Chicago Divinity School. And that it was a staple on a philosophically oriented bibliography is a testament to the good job that Ogden does in clarifying some of the basic conceptual issues at stake in thinking about the truth status of seemingly contradictory religious truth claims. But it's interesting that this book should figure so prominently in a philosophical bibliography, because among the things Ogden's book ends up clarifying, I think, is the extent to which the problem of religious pluralism is, in the final analysis, inescapably a theological problem and not just a philosophical problem. In fact, we can already tell from Ogden's title that he is addressing a specifically theological form of the question of pluralism. For Ogden's title clearly reflects that he already holds that there is at least one true religion, namely Christianity. So he doesn't ask the question, is there any true religion, or could there in principle be more than one true religion? But rather, could there be more than one true religion? And in assessing Ogden's argument, it seems to me helpful to keep in mind the more generally philosophical version of the title question, which would again be, can there in principle be more than one true religion? While Ogden's is an avowedly theological perspective, I would ask us to keep in mind the philosophical version of the question as we review his case, so that we might appreciate what parts of his arguments are and what are not suitable for appropriation as part of a more generally philosophical question. Now, Ogden's most basic answer to the question posed by this book's title might seem pedestrian, but it turns out to be quite insightful. To the question, is there only one true religion or are there many? Ogden answers, in effect, there might be many. Why does this answer represent an advance? On Ogden's reading, approaches to the title question have generally been of three sorts: exclusivist, inclusivist, or pluralist. Among Ogden's compelling insights is his appreciation of the fact that all of these three positions, inclusivism, exclusivism, and pluralism, have been held as a priori answers to the question. In other words, each of these three positions represents an answer that is taken to obtain in principle prior to and without regard to any actual engagement with any particular religions. So, for example, exclusivists would maintain, strictly on the basis of their own tradition's criteria, that we already know there cannot, in principle, be any other religion that is true. Pluralists, in contrast, are understood by Ogden as claiming that we're in a position to know already that many traditions are, in fact, true. Ogden's advance is to propose as an alternative what he considers to be the only reasonable a priori position, namely that there can be more than one true religion, but we'll have to wait and see what we find out about them. This makes the question of the truth of other religions an a posteriori question. Whether it is the case that there is more than one true religion must await extensive engagement with other traditions. And perhaps, this was attested to in one of the quotes from Ogden about, based on his experience of Buddhist-Christian dialogue quoted at the end of Bill's paper, perhaps further engagement with other traditions will only make it harder to decide whether different traditions are or are not finally in contradiction with one another. So much for a sketch of the different options. Ogden begins his discussion of them with a very useful clarification of what it would mean in the first place for any religion to be true. Here, Ogden introduces a distinction between formal and substantial truth. To be formally true is to set the norm in virtue of which anything else counts as true. To be substantially true, then, is just to be adequate to whatever norm is given in some such formal truth. And he suggests, quite rightly in my view, that what generally characterizes religious traditions is the claim on the part of each such tradition to be formally true. Religious traditions generally claim, that is, that this tradition sets the criteria according to which anything else could count as true. And we'll see that this distinction is quite helpful in his assessment of the available options. Now, Ogden's critique of the pluralist position is clearly the part of his argument that is most philosophically generalizable, and his arguments here perhaps carry conviction pretty much regardless of any theological commitments. The argument here, the argument against pluralism, is that the pluralist position ultimately winds up looking a lot like the inclusivist position. This is the case, at least, if the pluralist position is to avoid the self-referential incoherence that attaches to relativism. So most pluralists will presumably want to say that at least some religions are not true. That of the Aryan nations, for example, or Jim Jones's followers in Guyana. But the only way they can make that judgment is to invoke some criterion in virtue of which some religions are not true. But to invoke some such criterion is, in effect, to adopt something else as formally true. And the pluralist criteria, which usually remain implicit, may turn out to come from some particular religion or from the dictates of supposedly unaided reason. But to take some criterion as prior is, in effect, to allow only that the many true religions are merely substantially true. That is, they are true in virtue of their adequacy to the implicit criterion invoked by the pluralist. And that's just what the inclusivist position holds. That is, inclusivists hold that there may be other religions that are true insofar as they are somehow included in the home religion. That is, insofar as they have the kind of substantial truth that consists in adequacy to the formal truth established by the home religion. So, the fundamental problem with the pluralist position is that if it's to avoid the incoherence of conceptual relativism, it turns out, in fact, to presuppose some criterion, i.e. itself to be in possession of formal truth, but this is just inclusivism. And the problem, in turn, with inclusivism is that insofar as it's generally typical of religions to claim formal truth for themselves, to allow, as the inclusivist does, that other religions turn out merely to be substantially true is to credit them with something less than the truth they claim for themselves. Moreover, not only is it the case that pluralism in this way shades into inclusivism, further, inclusivism turns out to shade into exclusivism. For as we've seen, the inclusivist position, which turns out to claim that only the home religion is formally true and others merely substantially true, denies other religions the kind of truth they claim for themselves. Thus, the inclusivist's claim uniquely to possess formal truth represents an agreement with the exclusivist on the most important point. And the exclusivist perhaps just makes the further claim that no other tradition is even substantially true. So we can see that this distinction is doing some important work in deciding just what we're allowing with respect to any other traditions. But now, having reached the exclusivist position, we arrive at the point where Ogden's becomes a specifically theological case. For his main argument against exclusivism turns out to be an argument from the problem of evil. Ogden takes the decisive objection to exclusivism to be that it issues in a uniquely intractable form of the problem of evil. This is because the exclusivist effectively denies the possibility of salvation to perhaps the vast majority of persons who have ever lived, in which case the vast majority of persons who have ever lived end up being damned owing to no action or decision on their own part. It's a historically contingent fact that people are raised in the religions they happen to be raised in. A matter of chance, then, that only certain persons ever have the historical and contingent opportunity in the first place to encounter the Christian proclamation. But in that case, if only encountering and responding appropriately to that proclamation allows for salvation, the impossibility of salvation for most human persons turns out, on the exclusivist view, to be attributable only to God, a fact that compromises Ogden's central theological commitments. And I'd like to think those of many other Christians as well. But that it is particularly theological commitments that are compromised at this point is clear from some of the arguments Ogden makes at this point. For example, and here we recur to a point that came up a lot in Phil's talk this morning and again in Bill's talk just now about constitutive versus representative Christologies. So that theological commitments, not philosophically general commitments, are in play at this point in the argument is clear from the fact that Ogden argues that if one is to adopt the alternative he proposes, one must hold a representative Christology and not a constitutive one. This is because a constitutive Christology, on Ogden's reading, is by definition tantamount to the exclusivist claim that Christianity alone can be formally true. For a constitutive Christology just is the view that the Christ event sets or brings into being the norm in virtue of which anything else could be substantially true. Against this, Ogden argues that we can, as he wishes to, allow that it is at least possible that other religions are formally true if we do not take the Christ event as constituting formal truth, but rather as representing some other formal truth. Some formal truth, that is, such as other religions could, at least in principle, lay claim to. We can further appreciate that it's a specifically theological case at this point in the argument if we imagine deploying these arguments on behalf of, say, a Buddhist who wants to know if there's only one true religion or whether there are many. And if it were a Buddhist writing this book, of course, the starting presupposition would be that Buddhism is the true religion. There are many reasons why Buddhists might not face the same problem here, but perhaps the easiest to grasp is simply the fact that Buddhists tend to affirm belief in multiple lifetimes, in which case a Buddhist can be an exclusivist, can hold, in other words, that one can attain awakening only as a Buddhist, and yet still easily allow the possibility of salvation for all, simply by allowing that non-Buddhists can become Buddhists in future lifetimes. This is the position of the Gelug sect of Tibetan Buddhism upheld by the Dalai Lama, that emptiness as understood in the Gelug tradition has to be understood in order for awakening to come about. And the best you can do if you're not in a position to achieve that awakening in this lifetime is get yourself in a more advantageous rebirth. So, whatever virtue Ogden's arguments here have, it turns out not to be the kind of argument that could be readily appropriated by members of just any religion who wish to argue against their exclusivist co-religionists that exclusivism isn't an appropriate position. Now, to note in this way that Ogden's is a theological argument is not, of course, to criticize the argument. A theological argument is precisely what he claims to offer. But it seems to me one can reasonably wonder what parts of Ogden's case might be viable as part of a more generally philosophical approach to the basic conceptual problem of religious plurality. And here I would have us recall what I stated at the outset as the generically philosophical version of Ogden's question. Can there, in principle, be more than one true religion? A framing that doesn't presuppose that there's any true religion. So if we wish to advance a strictly philosophical appropriation of something like Ogden's case, our task would now be not to ask whether there is a priori any reason to suppose that there cannot, in principle, be any more than one true religion. And in fact, it seems to me there's a good argument to be made for the view that there could, in principle, be more than one true religion. And here, one of the points to be made is a point made by Ogden, that it turns out to await a lot of hermeneutical effort and study of other traditions before you can find this out. So it turns out the difficulty, the reason we have to say there can be more than one true religion, is that it turns out to be very difficult to say finally what any religion's claims mean. My point here is not the verificationist's point that religious claims are meaningless, but rather a hermeneutical point. A point in particular that religious claims are almost invariably highly complex and ramified, such that complete understanding of any one claim, if complete understanding were even possible, turns out to require attention to vast networks of interlocking beliefs. So it turns out it can take a lifetime to discover whether or not two different traditions are or are not finally in contradiction with one another. There can then conceivably be more than one true religion, and this because it's a highly complex and necessarily a posteriori task to come anywhere near enough to exhaustively understanding religious claims to know whether or not they are finally compatible or contradictory. So even if we hold a classically restricted notion of truth, a view according to which a claim and its logical contradictory cannot both be true, there's still good reason to think that we cannot know a priori whether or not there can be more than one true religion. For religions simply do not issue in the kinds of simple claims that are easily adjudicated, and we cannot therefore ever know a priori, and maybe not even a posteriori, whether or not two different religious claims are finally contradictory. Note, though, that this kind of philosophical argument, what I've represented as the philosophically generalizable case here, would have no purchase against somebody who already held on theological grounds that only their home religion can be true. So, while there are interesting philosophical issues that arise from the multiplicity of competing religious truth claims, the problem of other religions will also inevitably be a problem that theologians must address on their own theological grounds. And obviously Ogden does precisely this in the parts of his corpus where he argues for the necessity of adopting a constitutive rather than a representative rather than a constitutive Christology. That's the upshot of Ogden's focus on the existential question. That Christ is significant for posing the existential question, and the point, therefore, is not that we assent to the pre-modern cosmology of the ancient Near East, but that we ask what this says to us. And that can't be a function of determining what Christ the person was psychologically or metaphysically like in himself. But the point I wanted to conclude with, just by problematizing the scope of reason here, is that I think when we come to theological convictions like this, I have real doubts about the likelihood that people are going to be moved by transcendental arguments. And I speak as someone who's maybe second to none in my fondness for transcendental arguments. I dare say, though, that maybe more important, or at least as important here, would be not just what Ogden and Gamwell have taught us about reason, but the virtues exhibited, as remarked so movingly by Brett, among others, the virtues exhibited by Chris Gamwell and the conversational epistemic virtues, the interpersonal virtues, evident every time he starts his encounter by saying, "If I've understood you correctly." That's all I have to say.
All right. Well, I'm pleased to be here and to get to engage with both of you and all of you. So first of all, thank you, Bill, for an excellent paper elucidating the contributions of Gamwell and Ogden as the great completers of modernity, and reinvigorating the claim that reason can indeed be applied to comprehensive convictions. Dr. Meyer begins by outlining how Kant left a legacy of tension, whereby public life had only two options: to either impose some form of establishment or to privatize them as a personal hobby. And I hear the persistence of this tension in my classroom. When my students, I teach 120 undergraduate students a semester right now, and I hear them asking questions, their concerns, their quick solutions or explanations. Sometimes it comes out as, well, everyone's entitled to their own faith. Or quiet comments in papers that just ask whether truth matters. Sometimes it's more overt, as students suggest that, well, wouldn't life just be better if everyone just accepted Jesus as their Savior? And so the resonance of this binary options persists. Establishment of one religious solution in order to provide stability and intelligibility to the confusions of life, or not even just privatization, but a retreat into relativism. And in truth, I have empathy for my students as they grasp between these two solutions. It's indicative of how much this third way is needed, this way of reason, which Gamwell and Ogden have argued ought to be used for comprehensive convictions. And I would say that, again, if I started out with comprehensive convictions, my students might not really know what I'm talking about. So we might have to translate this. Are we talking about religious beliefs? But then further complexify the term to help them see the broad application of how religious beliefs function in and through cultural systems. I'm speaking of a Geertzianian understanding of religion here. So to put it in plain terms, Gamwell seems to suggest that the preservation of democracy must include space for reasonable discourse, which seeks the truth, and that this space includes the, quote, free and full rational public discourse about any question, even comprehensive ones, end quote. And the secularity of such a government, or public sphere, even including a non-confessional classroom like my own, persists not through avoidance of this kind of discourse, but through, as Dr. Meyer put it, the fact that, quote, the laws themselves cannot explicitly prescribe or proscribe any particular comprehensive doctrine, but the laws can be implicitly informed by those comprehensive convictions that generate a sufficient public consensus. In many ways, Gamwell's argument is a help toward further explaining, even to myself, my own pedagogical approach in the classroom, especially when I teach religious literacy. And I envision lawmakers who feel comfortable sharing from their religious convictions to explain why they have come to their perspectives on a policy decision. And indeed, sometimes we see this. But where it breaks down, as you were getting at as well, is when this discourse is unable to traverse the chasm of exclusive truth claims, and where anxiety about truth, capital T, leads to a power play of dominance. And to this concern comes Ogden's argument about a fourth way in addressing the question, is there only one true religion or are there many? And on the surface, I have great respect for the articulate argument that Ogden lays out as a possible way for religious freedom to persist through the insistence of, again, full and free discourse that rationally assesses all validity claims. Ogden's alternative gives space for each religion to claim implicitly or explicitly that they are formally true, as you were talking about in more great detail, and that then they can hold their integrity while still giving space for cross-cultural respect and dialogue that is necessary for democratic engagement. So all this to say, I'm on board. But here's the problem. A quick look around today tells us that the pendulum of our public life has swung quite far from the conditions that might allow this kind of full and free discourse on comprehensive convictions. So at the same time, I'd like to suggest that Dr. Meyer's paper offers us insights for understanding the increases in antagonistic Christian nationalism. For example, in your conclusion, you note that sociologist James Davison Hunter's observation that, quote, the authoritarian solution to the puzzle of e pluribus unum, out of many one, would be to impose an unum by force if need be. And I think we are currently experiencing the by force in our current administration. Religious freedom is indeed under threat. And not only a particular rebranding of Christianity as Christian nationalism rooted in exclusivism and violence, but here I think our term comprehensive convictions is a broad and helpful way to see how this by force clearly applies when we look, for example, at campaigns to bring higher lead in line with the administration's agenda, by force, with threat of withheld funding. More locally in Texas, we see by force through congressional redistricting before the appointed 10-year cycle, and new laws regarding the posting of the Ten Commandments, clearly establishing a particular religious group above others, imposing the unum. And sorrowfully, the list goes on. So my question, particularly, is what happens when it feels that we've gone past the moment for reason? So a little bit more about me. I work in constructive dialogue. I've been trained in what's called reflective structured dialogue with Dr. Jill DeTemple in our religious studies department here at SMU, and working and contracting with a nonprofit called Essential Partners. So I'm a practitioner, a facilitator, and a teacher for almost 10 years now in constructive dialogue. And part of constructive dialogue begins with the science of our brain chemistry, talking about why difficult dialogues are so difficult. And one particular aspect of difficult situations is that our brains get triggered. We get triggered into fight, flight, or freeze mode, where our brainstem is activated, and it overrides our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that allows us to think deeply and rationally and engage in discourse of reason, as Gamwell and Ogden argue is so significant toward the success of democracy. And I know you've all experienced this. This triggering is usually accompanied by physiological experiences, a heightened heart rate, sweaty, flushed cheeks, an inability to come up with the words that you want so that after the fact you think, if only I'd been able to say. So sometimes colloquially, this is called lizard brain, when we get triggered into our brain stem, into these fight, flight, freeze responses. And I explain all this in order to say that it seems as if as a nation, our collective prefrontal cortex has been hijacked, making this dimension of reason that is so vitally important almost inaccessible. Our experiences with the political are almost a clickbait of lizard brain moments. And in dialogue, we talk about this trigger to lizard brain and how it can happen in a millisecond. But then in contrast, it can take up to 30 minutes to calm back down and regain access to our prefrontal cortex. And usually that regaining of access also involves some kind of intentional action to assist the transition, stepping away, focusing on breathing, using material sensory awareness techniques. In other words, it's very difficult to recover once that flip into the brainstem occurs. And we teach this aspect of our brain chemistry in dialogue because in the context of facilitating potentially difficult dialogues, we want to create environments which will avoid the flip happening in the first place. So if I may make an analogy between the individual and the social, I, along with many others, often talk about our current moment as one of deep polarization, particularly on the political spectrum, perhaps also religiously. And I think polarization might be the societal equivalent to the individual lizard brain. Polarization happens when we move into an us-them narrative that flattens our counterpart or opposition, and we miss the complexity. And if it takes an individual intentional work 30 minutes to regain their prefrontal cortex, if we extend the analogy, what will it take for a society? So I think part of our answer needs to be there is a long road ahead to get back to this, if even possible. And I suspect what we need to think of in that time is what do we need to do intentionally with that time. And I have a couple of thoughts on this, but also I want to connect some ideas that I heard in Dr. Meyer's paper with my own field work. I'm an anthropologist of religion, and I've done field work with conservative evangelical Baptists who voted for Trump. So first, a connection and curiosity. I'm curious about the supposition Dr. Meyer makes in his conclusion in regards to the Enlightenment short-circuiting itself. Now, as someone who does not claim to be a scholar of Kant, I'm curious to hear more about what's behind this statement, but I'm curious also about how it could resonate. The quote was that Kant rejected the ongoing metaphysical enterprise, namely the rational attempt to discern the character of reality as such. And this post-metaphysical legacy, one might argue, has been one factor that has gradually contributed over time to the post-rational, post-fact world of our current 21st century. And so I'm zoning in here because as I read it, it was aligning with my own curiosities about whether some MAGA worldviews have developed out of a resistance to postmodern thought. That thought that is, that they're resistant to any, postmodern is resistant to any claims of universal reality and truth. And so this MAGA is trying to move back into establishing universal truth. And that for some conservative Trump voters, their support stems in part from a resistance to the instability of too many truths in the world, by which they feel compelled to more fully and exclusively make their truth the only truth for everyone. And where I think Ogden's argument is so helpful, it also seems too removed from the semantics of reality for some. So a second connection and curiosity related to Gamwell's use of Sidney Mead on page 3 of the paper. The explanation here was to support the religious freedom meant still leaning on the importance of rational discourse on comprehensive convictions. In some ways that this rational discourse on comprehensive convictions would be the substitution for what was previously thought of as necessary of religious establishment in order to provide social order and stability. And so that resonated with me. I've been teaching this semester on Habits of the Heart, sociological work by Robert Bella and colleagues in my Christianity in American Public Life class. And in there, Bella and colleagues agree with Tocqueville's 19th century assessment of how religion, even if in its voluntary form, was part of the solution in creating opportunities for limitation to an otherwise problem of a cultural individualism that would stem into isolationism and thus breed despotism. And what I'm wondering about when I look around today is that we seem to still be having a siloing and isolationism of religious convictions that's led to the authoritarianism that we're seeing at work today. So again, I'm wondering how the comprehensive convictions might also be similar to and yet different from the idea of civil religion, and how a Durkheimian understanding of religion suggests that attention to social binding and belonging by finding these common comprehensive convictions is deeply needed, and failure to attend to its preservation will and perhaps is leading to our societal democratic destruction. So really my questions do, though, come back to the pragmatic. In the context of such force and polarization, how do we move toward full, free, and rational discourse that can more calmly assess validity, and expand our openness to validity and other perspectives and comprehensive convictions without automatically getting triggered into feeling defensive or threatened. I do think dialogue might be a part of this, modeling it whenever possible, not falling prey to the patterns that we see developing, intentionally thinking about time and moving back as a society to that. And so I'm thinking I would love to hear more conversation as we move forward about connecting this to pedagogy. How does this work in the classroom? And I know the next panel is on implications for ministry. As a former pastor, even myself, and an ethnographer of a congregation with politically polarizing tendencies, how do we bring this discourse into the congregation as well, into churches and religious settings, that might be a training ground of sorts. So again, thank you so much. Provocative and needed paper.
Okay. Thank you three very much. If you'd come down here and have a seat, that would be wonderful. Surprise, surprise, we're up against time again. I think, so we'll go to about 4:10 with this session, and then I do want to give about an hour and 5 minutes or so to the panel on ministry. So, having said that, Dr. Meyer, you want to lead us off?
Thank you. Thank you to both of you for your thoughtful responses. I'll start with Marie. Thank you. I'm very interested in your work. As you were speaking, I thought of the old but true adage, well, generally true, that politics flows downstream from culture. And you both raised the question, alluded to the question, do people like Gamwell and Ogden envision this kind of ideal rational discourse that seems so far from where we are? And that may be true, but the changing the direction of culture, changing the stream of culture is what the role of education has been throughout the ages, and particularly liberal arts education, right? Mm-hmm. So as you nicely alluded to, and we're fighting forces of the digital age, which is triggering this lizard brain, which is fostering a body politic that is so polarized and divisive on a macro scale. Liberal education is more important than ever and more in danger than ever, which is always true. I teach a freshman seminar on freedom, democracy, and the threat of authoritarianism. And I used to have my students, when I could get them to read a whole novel, read Sinclair Lewis's 1936 novel, 35 novel, It Can't Happen Here, when Lewis envisioned an America that elected a president who quickly dismantled our democracy and imposed an authoritarian regime. Right? And the title was meant to be ironic, of course. One of the characters says early, oh, that couldn't happen here. Don't worry about it. Sure enough, it happens. And in that novel, the authoritarian president of the United States shuts down liberal arts colleges, leaves technical schools open, because there is merely instrumental reason, right? So I do think, right, I mean, this goes back to Plato, one of the functions of education is to envision the ideals by which we can provide a yardstick, an evaluative principle, as Chris would say, by which we can assess the alternatives. We can't know how sick we are if we don't know what health is. We can't know what a free society looks like if we don't have a conception of what civil discourse can be. I take Chris to be arguing that the American experiment was an oddity of history, and he seems to think it doesn't make sense if we can't ultimately talk to each other about these comprehensive questions. If that's what I was trying to allude to about short-circuiting. Right? It's right there in Kant. Both the affirmation of dare to know, dare to use your own reason, and then, but you can't use your reason for what ultimately matters. It's beyond the limits of reason. that seems to create attention. Dan, in reference to your discussion of Ogden's work, two thoughts come to mind. First, on the title of the work, is there only one true religion, or are there many? He said he doesn't consider that there may be no true religion. I wondered that too at one point, but then as I worked through him this summer, it's clear to me his point is that there is, because he's using the word, using religion broadly. Let's use the word comprehensive conviction. There is at least one true comprehensive conviction, whatever it is, about the character of reality. There may be more than one form, but so there is something true about the character of reality, and that's what he means by a true religion. So there is at least one true religion. There may be many more than that, but yes, it clarified for me working through Schubert's work again. There's no absence, or there's something true about the character of reality, whatever it is, and that's the task of seeking to discern it. And the second thing is, I heard when I read your response, when you kindly sent it to me and heard it again today, that, do I understand you correctly that you see the constitutive representative distinction to be a theological one, not a more general philosophical one?
No, it's the problem he needs to address at that point, which is the problem of evil that exclusivism raises. And that's not a problem that arises in the same way for other traditions.
It seems to me that his fundamental critique of exclusivism is its monistic, its undertone, monistic fundamental position, which is rooted in its constitutive outlook. So the constitutive position is the fundamental mistake, it seems to me. And I'm inclined to think that Schubert's distinction between constitutive and representative can do work broadly, more philosophically, and you could tell me better than I know, is the nature of religious fundamentalism in whatever tradition an expression of an implicit constitutive outlook at work.
Dogmatism.
What's that?
It's dogmatism.
Dogmatism, yeah. Which Whitehead always called the Antichrist of learning. Yeah, yeah. So,
no, I think that's a good point. The representative constitutive distinction, I agree. You can do work in different contexts. In identifying the particular theological moment in the argument, it was more about the problem of evil that uniquely arises.
And it is certainly true, and Phil can speak to this better than I, but Schubert developed distinction in thinking about Christology. But I think the distinction, before Schubert died, my last note to him, I said that I thought that distinction was one of his seminal contributions to the history of theology, because it seems to me to have such profound depth and application to thinking about the nature of our relation to ultimate reality.
It occurs to me to add, in a slightly different vein, but I think this will still kind of continuing the conversation, that a Buddhist perspective, I think, has a lot to contribute here. I am myself thoroughly Kantian in thinking that responsiveness to reasons is wherein our freedom consists. And I quite agree with the plea for a liberal arts education and the very idea of understanding presupposes our responsiveness to reasons, and that that's a crucial part of us, and we're lost without it. But I also agree with Buddhists that we're not nearly as responsive to reasons as we think we are. We're not nearly as autonomous as we think we are. Our exercises of reason tend to be made under the influence of a lifetime of psychic baggage, and all to be formed by basically misguided self-grasping orientation. So what Buddhist tradition brings to this, and this is evident too, I think, in William James's radical empiricism and in Peirce as well, is appreciation of how many other non-rational factors are always in play in the exercise of reason, and brings to it a basically virtue ethical stance according to which knowing the right thing is a very tiny part of what's significant ethically, and far more significant is cultivating the right kinds of dispositions.
A necessary but not sufficient condition.
Yeah, and so the Buddhist tradition starts with the idea that the Four Noble Truths are not a creed that demand our assent. These are something to be made vividly real through practices of devoted. We have to change who we are psychologically. And our responsiveness to reasons is integral to the possibility of doing that, but they recognize to a different extent, I think, the insufficiency of that by itself.
Do you want to say?
Oh, no,
I would think Schubert and Chris would.
Well, that's original sin. That's our version of this.
Our estrangement is delicacy.
Sure.
Yeah. And that it's I'm working on a book called Secular Without Secularism, Affirming the Value of Life in the World. And so a distinction I learned from Chris and from Schubert, and I think it's a really important distinction, trying to affirm again the value of modernity, the Enlightenment, and trying to figure out how to make sense of these comprehensive questions. But this question of public discourse, right? William Conley wrote a book in 1999 called Why I'm Not a Secularist. Now, Conley's own metaphysics, he wrote a later book on, what's it called, trust, reality, which his view of the universe is secularistic, but he kind of criticizes modern public discourse as being, too rational, not open enough to the emotional vents. And looking at that book now, 25 years later, we're full of emotional venting right now, right? And the call to reason, Whitehead, again, said reason was the great preserver of sanity. God knows we need some sanity.
Yeah.
However hard it is to achieve.
So we have a question? I have a question. Oh, hold on. They're right with you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm thinking there's a pragmatic question underneath that I don't know if we've addressed yet, and that is what is the function of religion? What does it do in society? How does it fulfill whatever role it has been given in society? And then after that, you might say, and is it true? I mean, it's because religion is so much more complex than philosophy, in that it deals with the how of people living together as a group. And as we now know very well today, it can be so distorted as to make us all enemies of one another. But then the question of truth is a separate question than the question of religion itself, I think.
I like Chris Gamwell's take on the relation between and difference between religion and philosophy, and Ogden too. I think they both take religion and philosophy to be two different modes in which the existential question is posed and addressed. Well, but religion poses it in a way that's meant to be motivating, right? Philosophy poses it in ways that keep the question open, that endlessly subjecting it to critical scrutiny. But meanwhile, we have to act. We can't await the outcome of indefinite reason before we act in the world. And so there has to be some way of addressing that is galvanizing somehow. And so religion is the mode of addressing it that is with an eye towards inspiring hope and faith, the basis for actually acting.
Yeah, if I might too, I think this is what I was trying to get at when I was talking about a Durkheimian understanding and how it relates to civil religion, that I'm wondering if that's actually part of what is being created and putting these two together, is saying that the public discourse, full rational discourse on comprehensive convictions is like a creation of the functional religion that overgirds like the specificity of Christianity and Buddhism and Islam, but that's that civil religion that can create the ties that bind to hold democracy together. That's what I was kind of thinking of when I said that, if that makes sense.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, as Brett referred to this morning, for Chris, the formal commitments, the procedural, the constitutional commitments to the public order is about creating space for full and free participation.
Right.
The substantive answers, which I always assumed Durkheim was looking more for a substantive sense of bond connectedness, that's what's to be worked out in the procedural, ideally worked out in the procedural conditions, is seeking to come to some consensus about the ultimate principle of evaluation, right? I mean, you know, the treatment of undocumented people, are they children of God, or are they, you know what our president describes them as? That's the fundamental question of evaluation. And that's why that's how the comprehensive conviction informs one's political decisions and activity.
Well, and I would add as well that Ogden's emphasis, and Gamwell's too, this is another point that we share, on the significance of religion as posing the existential question. That's one answer to the question of what religion is for. Probably for most people, it's an opiate. It's about, as David Foster Wallace put it, insignificance management. It's about dealing with the fact that we die and are not the center of the world.
But that
focus on the existential question. On that understanding, religion is demanding. It's calling us. It's not saying everything's going to be all right. It's calling us to be our better selves. And that sort of stance is epitomized, I think. I've always attributed this to Kierkegaard. Somebody in here will probably actually know if this is wrong, but that when asked, are you a Christian, the right answer is, I hope so.
And with that hope, we're going to have to move on. Thank you so much. Many thanks to our presenter, Dr. Meyer, and to his respondents, Dr. Arnold and Reverend Dr. Purcell. I now ask that the moderator of and participants on the panel on ministry take their seats up front here so that we may begin the final featured component of today's program. Our closing program will consist of a panel on ministry. Throughout their long, distinguished careers, both Ogden and Gamwell taught ministry students and attended, each in his own way, to their training and preparation for professional ministry. Gathered here before us this afternoon is a panel of distinguished clergy and religious teachers who have had either their ministry shaped by Ogden's and/or Gamwell's teaching and writing, or their religious teaching vocation influenced by the same basic process or panentheistic commitments as our two protagonists. Before introducing each of the panelists, it is fitting to introduce, or rather reintroduce, or introduce again, this afternoon's moderator, Reverend Dr. Stone. Dean Stone will share with us his own reflections and moderate a discussion among our four panelists, after which the conversation will be extended to include you, the audience. Our panelists this afternoon are, from my right to left, Dr. Marjorie Hewitt Suhaki, Ingraham Professor of Theology Emerita, Claremont School of Theology, and former co-director of the Center for Process Studies. Reverend John A. Wright, former superintendent of the Hill Country District of the Rio, Texas Conference, UMC, and former pastor of First UMC, Austin, Texas, as well as a recipient of a Master's of Theology degree in 1997 from the Perkins School of Theology. Then we have Reverend Dr. Paul E. Capitz, pastor of Christ Church by the Sea, UMC, Newport Beach, California, and Professor Emeritus of Historical Theology, United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. Finally, the Reverend Alexander E. Sharp, Executive Director, Clergy for a New Drug Policy, and former Acting Executive Director, the Community Renewal Society, and Executive Director Emeritus, Protestants for the Common Good. And so without further ado, Dean Stone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will not have a bunch of preliminary remarks for the sake of time. I will ask our panelists to keep between 5 and 10 minutes, and when you're 2 minutes close to 10 minutes, I'll be going like that. I do want to say one thing at the beginning. The only thing I'll say is that when I was first going in doing more with, I started off doing more systematic theology and eventually went towards practical theology, even though I was still doing philosophical and systematic. I talked to him about that move, and he thought that the best way to go towards practical theology was to start with philosophical theology and systematic theology, that those are great backgrounds, not at all something different than what you would do when you're thinking about ministry and practical theology. And I still remember that conversation, and it stuck with me for life, so I was deeply appreciative of that. We'll start with you, Dr. Suhaki.
Oh dear, I was told not to write a paper, so I didn't. I see everybody's.
Well, okay.
I want to start with quoting from Ogden on To Teach the Truth, and then relate it to a question this morning, and that brings me to the question of ministry. Here's the quote. The symbol of, I want to make clear the faith of which it is the symbol of the faith whose existential meaning is existence in perfect freedom in and under God's love, both the freedom from ourselves and the world, and the freedom for them, that is, love, which in the case of all our fellow human beings can only be the freedom for our fellow human beings as well, to be free, that they shall also be free, and above all, to exist in the same radical freedom of faith in God's love. That is from Ogden's To Teach the Truth, and I'm very compatible with what he wrote on Preaching the Truth as well. And this morning the issue was raised of equality as one of the necessities of a democracy. Well, democracy, equality is democracy in action, and it's much like allowing room for the kind of freedom that Ogden talks about in this book and in so much of his writing. But in the church, of which I am not a minister, except that I am deeply involved in the ministry of the church because I go to it every single week.
Good for you.
And I love church. And I see in my church an attempt both to continue this stuff that Ogden is talking about in terms of freedom for, freedom from, which is basically love. And then this issue that was raised this morning of equality. Equality, that the church needs to be involved, especially when society backs away from equality. The church must be called to do what it can for the issue of equality, which means to feed the hungry, Roanoke Feed Pantry, to look out for immigrants who are in your community, to look for those whose language is not English and whose children need to learn it, to look to helping children as they assimilate to the new language of the country where they are. There's so much of equality that needs to be done, and the church seems to me to be the one organization, the church and other religious organizations. We have relations with the Mormon Church. There are no Buddhist communities where I live, but I have a Buddhist daughter-in-law. That helps. I love her dearly. That the church is maybe the last bastion in which democracy can be practiced when it's being demolished all around us. That to search for equality to food is a really basic and simple one. It's one we can do. We have a red cart in the narthex of our church, and we get a list every month. This is what the food pantry needs. And so that cart is full every single week, and every single week the teenagers take it away to bring to the food pantry so it begins empty again, and then next week it's full again. This is equality, looking for the ability of people to have food that they can afford when the prices of food keep going up and work becomes tenuous. Church has become the last bastion for equality, and that to me is a ministry to which we are called, and that the word that is preached to us by you guys and women, we have women, we have both women and men in the ministry of our church, and other differences as well that I appreciate very much. Anyhow, it's what we're finally called to, and I worry that we're the last bastion of it. And if in fact we live up to that kind of call for freedom, a freedom to love, a freedom to flourish, an equality to the best that we're able to offer in our communities for the people in and around us, may be the last bastion where democracy can thrive and maybe get it back for our country again. That's both negative and positive. Thank you for your ministry in the church.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. Dr. Capets. Oh, I'm sorry, which one? John, Dr. Wright. Reverend Wright, Dr.
Yes.
Wright.
First, let me start with a hyperbole, not literally true, but almost. I'm not sure I could have stayed in the ministry if it had not been for Schubert Ogden. For a number of my colleagues, the tension between credibility and the church's historical faith claims became so great that they chose to leave ministry. And at least in the last congregation I served, though they would think of themselves as mainline to liberal, there was still a tension felt by many for whom theology simply meant rationalization. We talked about that this morning, rationalization of the truth claims. And as Dr. Miles mentioned, how can I be a Christian today? At the time, 10 or 15 years ago, it took the form, in my case, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this too, do I really have to believe in the virgin birth or the Trinity? What a relief they felt when I explained that the story of Jesus' miraculous conception was a symbol expressing his decisiveness for human existence, and that his title as Son of God, originally expressive of his function as the one through whom God's love for the world is decisively revealed, was later taken to be a claim about his very essence, such that a doctrine of the Trinity became inevitable, but that, as my teacher Ogden explained, quote, none of the New Testament writers can be said to have had a properly Trinitarian conception of God. Therefore, it cannot be necessary, but he went on to say, even if it may be helpful in some ways to think of God in Trinitarian terms. What set me free from fideism, the tyranny that I must simply take certain claims about God and the Christian faith on the basis of external authority, simply because the Bible or the creeds or the General Conference or any of the myriad manifestations of the Grand Inquisitor, which Philip Devenish so aptly invoked this morning, simply because they say so. What set me free, of course, was Ogden's adaptation of Bultmann's method of demythologization, namely that what appear from our modern scientific worldview to be patently false claims about divine interventions and miraculous manipulations are in fact really existential truth claims about authentic human existence. A second related point was Ogden's insistence on grounding those existential truth claims of Scripture in properly metaphysical truth claims, lest they become no more than emotivism. That is nothing more than our own psychological projections of the way we would like existence to be, in contrast to the cold, hard reality of the way existence actually is. Thus, in Faith and Freedom, Mr. Ogden writes, to trust in God's love as it is decisively represented in Jesus Christ is clearly to presuppose that the mystery encompassing our existence really is the God who loves both us and all our fellow creatures. Consequently, unless this belief about God were true, there clearly would be no point whatever either in our trusting in God, in God's love, or in our being faithful to God. Belief, or that is trust in God, entails certain beliefs about God. I think we need this metaphysical grounding of our faith is much or more so now as ever, because in our reaction to the kind of dogmatic fundamentalism that majors in rationalizing the Christian faith, and in the Christian nationalism, both of those now straitjacketing American religious culture, we liberal and progressive Christians often end up, this is just me, embracing a gobbledygook mixture of old age Gnosticism and new age pantheism, masquerading as a kind of self-help pseudo panentheism that assures us, for example, that, quote, as the wave becomes one with the ocean, so the self becomes one with the sacred cosmos. We're told that a religion can only be felt, not known, that its symbols are really not about any objective reality distinct from ourselves, that only as we grow in consciousness of the true self within us, which is that inner spark, inner divine spark that is nothing less than God in us being God in a sense, can we experience personal liberation. I can only wish that Mr. Ogden were here in the flesh to snort and contort as only he could do to express his disdain for such conceptual nonsense. My third point, through much of my career, pastoral career, I bore the shame of not having completed my PhD dissertation. But in 2010, a group of us former students met with Mr. Ogden in Denver. There he reminded me in no uncertain terms of who I am, who and what I am, telling me, quote, whenever I hear one of my former students introduce a statement by some such disclaimer as, well, of course, I'm not a professional theologian, but he went on to say, I always feel obliged to remind her or him by saying, you may not be an academic theologian, all right, but unless and until you return your MDiv diploma from Perkins, I intend to hold you accountable for being an ecclesial and therefore professional theologian. Perhaps one reason why the church has not succeeded in the ministry of social, political, and economic liberation in the way we would like for it to is that way too many of us ordained ministers have not taken seriously our vocation as professional ecclesial, and I would go on to add practical theologians. You see, the very first class many of us had with Ogden in 1973 was called Theological Method. Our basic text was a 13-page article he had written entitled, What is Theology?, which we scrutinized line by line for an entire semester. In that article, Ogden distinguished historical, systematic, and practical theology. If practical theology asks, what is the Christian witness of faith, such that it is both appropriate to Jesus and credible to human experience, then practical theology goes on to ask, what should the Christian witness of faith now be, so that it is not only appropriate to Jesus and credible to human experience, but also fitting to the present situation. Those of you who go to church know each week in sermons and classes, we preachers, teachers, sweat and slave and turn ourselves into knots to take up the task of translating the existential truths of Scripture and the complex concepts of systematic theology into images, metaphors, and stories that are, quote, fitting to the present situation while remaining appropriate to Jesus, and credible to human experience. To do that, we draw upon the songs, plays, movies, novels, poetry, the sports events and current events of our contemporary culture. And Dean, as much as we need seminary courses in preaching, teaching, pastoral care, and church administration, we also need courses in the gospel and modern fiction, the gospel and the Oscars, the gospel and the Grammys, the gospel and country music. If I had just one sentence to say to seminarians, it would be, claim your vocation as professional, ecclesial, practical theologians. One final point, and this will seem really out of date for some of you, but remember, we're doing our ministry deep in the heart of Texas. And I'm talking about 10 years ago when my wife, Barbara Ruth, and I first became co-pastors at First Methodist Church in Austin. Yes, a blue dot, but still deep in the heart of Texas. My wife and I felt called to lead our church to join the Reconciling Ministries movement, which, as many of you know, advocates for the welcome and full inclusion of LGBTQ persons in the life of the church, including ordination and marriage. But could we defend, for example, the church's acceptance of same-sex marriage in the face of prima facie scriptural prohibitions and virtually 20 centuries of tradition opposing it? I suppose we could have jettisoned scripture and tradition altogether and appeal to the so-called Wesleyan quadrilateral criterion of reason and contemporary experience, and certainly I would need to kind of put a footnote on that, given all that we've talked about the role of reason today. But to do so would have ignored the first question, which, according to Ogden, both the academic and ecclesial theologian must ask, namely, is the proposed action an instance of appropriately Christian witness? That is, does it accord with the primary norm to which all expressions of the Christian faith should conform, that norm being the earliest witness to Jesus' words and deeds as it has been made available to us through 2 centuries of the historical critical study of the Synoptic Gospels. If we ask what the material content of this norm is, I would summarize it in a passage from Professor Gamwell. Jesus is the Christ because he is the one through whom the saving love for God for all the world is decisively revealed, so that Christian faith means entrusting oneself completely to the God Jesus reveals and thereby embracing the commandment given with God's love, namely to love God unreservedly and to love one's neighbor as oneself. That is finally the only Christian commandment, and it defines the abiding content of the Christian faith. Anything else must be consistent with this calling, end quote. So in light of this norm, Barbara and I, we reason that unless a lifelong covenant of mutual love and fidelity between 2 persons of the same sex, unless that can be definitively and definitely shown to fail fundamentally to express faithfulness to Jesus' love command, the church should honor such such a marriage covenant, and the Christian pastor should act as an agent of liberation for all LGBTQ persons. I hope these 4 points have given you a window into how Ogden's systematic theology has shaped my own understanding and practice of ministry within the church and the public sphere.
Thank you very much, Reverend Wright. Dr. Kapetz? Is that the way I pronounce it correctly?
Kapetz.
Thank you very much.
Well, what a great day this is, and I'm happy to be here. I envy you that class with Ogden in 1973. Well, I'm greatly honored by the invitation to speak here today and exceedingly grateful for this opportunity to pay tribute to Schubert, Ogden, and Franklin Gamwell. I owe an incalculable intellectual debt to both of these teachers on account of their profound contributions to my own education in matters theological and philosophical. I will speak of what their legacy means to me as someone whose primary vocational calling in life has been to serve in the pastoral ministry of the liberal Protestant church, and whose work as a teacher in graduate theological education and as a scholar of theology has always been devoted to the furtherance of the liberal Protestant church and its understanding of Christian faith. I once heard Ogden say that he believed his greatest contribution to Christian theology to lie in the distinction he insisted upon making between bearing witness and doing theology. Bearing Christian witness is not the same as doing Christian theology, which is rather the fully critical reflection upon such witness. Conversely, doing theology is not the same as bearing witness, since the service of theology to the task of bearing witness can only ever be an indirect service, never a direct one. All the same, this service that theology renders is vitally important on account of the two main questions theology asks about witness. First, what does it mean? And second, is it true? The first question is that of understanding the meaning of Christian witness. What claim is being made by it? How is this claim to be understood? The second question is that of truth or validity. Is the claim made by Christian witness true? Can this claim be validated as true before the forum of reason and common human experience? Now, there's surely more that can be said about Ogden's proposal for how we should understand the theological task, but for my present purpose, this is sufficient. I begin my reflections with the succinct statement of Ogden's contribution, since it has always seemed to me to be a major step forward beyond the traditional view of Christian theology shared by Catholic and Protestant alike and captured in the slogan, faith-seeking understanding, whereby belief in the truth of Christian faith is a necessary prerequisite to any attempt at understanding it rationally. According to this time-honored view of theology, the only question for theology is really that of the meaning of witness, since its truth is presupposed at the outset of theological inquiry, and nothing within such inquiry can ever call into question the truth of this witness. This classical view of theology is thus essentially authoritarian, since it posits divinely or supernaturally sanctioned sources and norms to which the theologian must submit in obedience, whether Scripture and tradition as interpreted by the Church's infallible teaching office in Roman Catholicism, or Scripture alone in classical and conservative modern Protestantism. As a liberal Protestant, however, I reject both versions of this authoritarian view of theology. Indeed, I rejected it long before I came under Ogden's influence, but once I did encounter his work, I realized that he had formulated clearly and compellingly the understanding of theology for which I had hitherto been groping, but hadn't quite been able to put into words myself. By definition, liberal Protestantism seeks to carry forward the heritage of the Reformation after crossing the Rubicon of the Enlightenment by testing each and every interpretation of Christian faith not only for its appropriateness as measured by the apostolic witness that is the source and norm of the writings collected in the New Testament, but also for its intelligibility or credibility, as this can be validated solely by an appeal to rational reflection upon our shared experience of being human. Accordingly, Gamwell characterizes this aspect of liberal theology as the modern commitment, or as he also calls it, the humanistic commitment. He writes, "Modernity is distinguished by the increasing affirmation that our understandings of reality and of ourselves in relation to it cannot be validated or redeemed by appeals to some authoritative expression or tradition or institution. In other words, our understandings can be validated or redeemed only by appeal in some sense to human reason and experience as such. Because it is identified by this latter appeal, the modern affirmation may also be called the humanistic commitment." I thus take Ogden's distinctive contribution to our understanding of theology's task and Gamwell's eloquent formulation of the modern or humanistic commitment as correctly identifying the characteristic genius or spirit of liberal Protestantism. As a form of religion, liberal Protestantism seeks to represent the properly existential meaning of ultimate reality for us human beings, and therefore only a non-authoritarian model of theology can do justice to the existential, metaphysical, and moral claims made by its religious witness. But sadly, I have to admit that in my estimation, the present prospects for liberal Protestantism are grim. There are at least two main reasons for this estimate. On the one hand, there is currently in our society a dramatic upsurge of fundamentalist religion that is making common cause with a dangerous right-wing political movement that threatens to undo our democracy itself. Since this kind of religion is not only authoritarian, but also explicitly anti-modern, it rejects the autonomy of modern science, history, and ethics that have defined the legacy of the Enlightenment, and instead calls for obedient submission to its dogmatic interpretation of the Bible in matters of science, history, and ethics.
Just 2 more minutes.
I came 2,000 miles to make this point, and I think it needs to be heard.
Go for it. Go for it.
On the other hand, those of us who represent what in its heyday was called mainline Protestantism are on the decline. The number of people attending our churches is dropping, and this means that we have fewer financial resources to support our institutions of theological education that have historically been the bearers of this liberal theological tradition that I prize so much. Many of our seminaries have been forced to close their doors or to sell their campuses and move into smaller spaces. Also, many of the great divinity schools that used to cultivate this liberal Protestant theological tradition in the context of an interdisciplinary university are being transformed into departments of religious studies that eschew normative inquiries such as theology altogether. But I'm afraid that the problem runs even deeper, and so I must give yet a third reason for my depressing forecast. For 28 years, I served as a professor at 4 mainline Protestant seminaries. And in all that time, I encountered very few students preparing for ordained ministry who truly cared about the rigorous study of theology and saw its importance for their future work as pastors. I've come to realize that the anti-intellectualism of American culture, to which Richard Hofstadter drew our attention long ago, is not only a feature of fundamentalist and evangelical forms of Christianity, but also is now deeply entrenched among us. Additionally, and this is a fourth reason to adduce for the sorry state of liberal Protestantism today, many ministers and seminarians who are left of center have been so thoroughly captivated by the trains of thought emanating from deconstructive postmodernism that they do not believe in the category of truth at all anymore. I am often told by adherents of this movement that supposed claims to truth are nothing but disguised expressions of the will to power, which must be unmasked as the ideologies they are in order to expose their actual intent to dominate, colonize, and oppress others. The problem, as Gamwell points out, is that left-wing academic culture in Europe and America has relinquished the belief in universal reason that was constitutive of what is now disdainfully referred to as the Enlightenment Project. From the postmodernist viewpoint, the so-called Enlightenment was predicated on this false belief in universal reason. Even those students who have not actually read the works of postmodernist thinkers have been infected by this suspicion of truth claims. I can't tell you how many seminarians have told me there's no such thing as universal truth. There is only my truth and your truth. But then, in the very next breath, these same students insist that it is always wrong to oppress people. If that's not a claim to universal truth, I don't know what is. Of course, this is an example of what Gamwell calls pragmatic self-contradiction, whereby one implicitly affirms what one has explicitly denied. Along with this denial of universal reason, there is equal wariness among these left-wing students and ministers of any notion of common human experience. Claims to identify anything common or universally shared in human experience are suspected of being hegemonic for their supposed exclusion of the particular and specific experiences of those without power and privilege. Accordingly, I can only speak of my experiences and those of my group, just as you can only speak of your experiences and those of your group. In this respect, it appears to me that there is a tribal character in this mentality, which is the left-wing variation of the sort of tribalism we see so vividly on the right. Surprisingly, then, the two ends of the spectrum meet in their agreement that there is no universal reason and no common human experience to which we could appeal in the adjudication of our respective claims. I could go on and share many anecdotes from my time as a professor that illustrate this left-wing mindset, but I think you all get my point. Even among that segment of the religious population usually identified as liberal, there are many who no longer share the modern or humanistic commitment, and thus are not willing or able to distinguish between bearing witness and theological reflection on witness. They are thus no longer liberal in this sense, and many of them are at least honest enough explicitly to repudiate the term liberal, to describe themselves. In the final analysis, I judge that this loss of theology as a critical and self-critical enterprise that is distinct from, but nonetheless essential to the task of bearing witness, has led to a deep religious crisis in the mainline churches. In short, we have no gospel to preach anymore. Too many of the sermons I've heard in our churches over the past 4 decades are intellectually vacuous because there is no theological depth of meaning in them. They lack genuine conviction and thus are existentially unconvincing as adequate interpretations of human existence in its religious dimension. The loss of a vital theology leads to a loss of the vitality of witness itself. It's my firm belief that unless we are able to recapture a vivid sense of what my namesake in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, spoke of as the truth of the gospel, our movement is going to die. And for me, this would be nothing short of a tragedy, for it is my conviction, to which I've given my life, that liberal Protestantism is indeed one of the greatest religious and intellectual achievements of the human spirit. On this occasion, when we gather to honor and to celebrate the legacy of Ogden and Gamwell, which consists in nothing so much as their unwavering commitment to truth in both religion and theology, I must lament that the liberal Protestant tradition that has so decisively shaped my life as a Christian, a minister of the church, and a theologian is in great peril. And I have no doubt that Ogden and Gamwell, if they were with us here today, would surely agree with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kevin. Reverend Sharp.
Okay. Well, to my predecessors on the panel, I appreciate the great comments. I actually could spend most of my time responding to what you said about what is religion and what you say, and you're truly a lament. But I do have a special niche, and I will proceed with that, and then maybe we can come back in my comments. I will say you laid out exactly what's happening, but you haven't really said what we're going to do about it.
Oh, I don't know what. That's why I wanted to say it to you. I need your help.
Okay, but I think the core of the answer is in what Ogden and Gamwell have given us, but we have no idea how to bring it forward in popular form. I'm going to say something that may annoy especially the more metaphysical people among us, but I spent some time now with Richard Rohr. And I will tell you, I go on a lot of Zoom meetings, and sometimes those meetings are opened with a prayer. And I will say, well, I'm going to read a passage from Richard Rohr. And I'll tell you, everybody on that Zoom almost always says, they pay attention. Visually, they respond. I think we might want to ask ourselves why. I could make a very good case, I think, for the notions of Richard Rohr, which some may say are touchy-feely, and maybe Ogden would have despised him, I don't think they would, are very much paralleled in the notion of process, or I would say relational theology. I've used up 2 of my minutes, so I'm going to try to shorten the rest of my comments. My special niche here is because I actually had an extraordinary opportunity that none of you have had. I was a student of Chris Gamwell's. Great privilege, and always, I will say, had the chance when I was in divinity school to take courses. Phil Devenish was always right down the hall. I was 50 years old when I went to divinity school. I was full of questions. I would roar into Phil's office. I'd say, Phil, tell me about this. He would always tell me, and I will always be grateful. So anything I say reflects that gratitude. So how did I know Gamwell in a special way? Because just as I was graduating from divinity school, he and a bunch of other folks were, I'm eliminating most of my remarks here, were in fact trying to start an organization that gave political embodiment to all that you've heard about Chris. And the goal was politics as a Christian vocation. He gathered around him several ministers and lay leaders in Chicago. This founding group hosted an organizing event to test the idea of providing an alternative vision to the Christian right. We were really going to focus on the Christian right, which is now, of course, so virulent and is now veering towards headed directly towards Christian nationalism. Over 700 people showed up to an event to test this idea. We had some key speakers, Kevin Tyson among them, and the concept thus affirmed They established a 501c3 not-for-profit organization. To build the organization, they hired me, mostly on the recommendation of the Reverend William Sloane Coffin, an honor greater than which I cannot imagine. I got to tell you, talk about eclipse of declining Protestantism. When I talk to anybody under the age of 40 and I ask who was William Sloane Coffin, almost nobody knows. It's amazing. But anyway, moving on. From the beginning, our goal was to mobilize as many individuals as we could from churches, ministers, and lay alike throughout Illinois, where, of course, we were based. Focusing on Illinois, mostly Chicago and nearby cities and towns, was a pragmatic decision. We did not think we would ever have the bandwidth to be a national presence, especially if we wanted to engage people one-to-one in churches. So we had a hands-on working board, which I encouraged. Some people are afraid of their boards. I learned from my board. We created a mission statement. Protestants for the common good educates and mobilizes people of faith to participate in political democracy for the sake of social justice. Our outreach strategy, and I don't see many ministerial candidates right here in this audience, but I would encourage ministerial candidates to think about what we actually tried to do. Our strategy was to design events to attract our desired constituency. I remember our first event in LaGrange, Illinois. The topic was a debate between the local candidates for the state senate. Maybe not a religious topic, but if religious issues are at stake, it surely was. Another event in Oak Park, we invited an Illinois icon, Senator Paul Simon, to speak, hosted by the First Presbyterian Church there. The hub of our continuing outreach was Vintage Gamwell, a discussion series, 4 parts, beautifully crafted, written mostly by Chris. And with these texts as our topic, over 4 Sundays, we would ask ministers to schedule us in their churches, usually on Sunday, before or after the main service. I spent at least 3 Sundays a week for the next 15 years leading such discussion groups. And of course, we sought to have a tangible political impact. Almost from the beginning, we had established a policy committee of the board and began to identify issues which, taken together, constituted our common good agenda. Key from the beginning were public education. The aphorism there was the quality of a public education depended on what school district you happened to be born in, based, of course, on the income of that district. Welfare policy, housing, criminal justice, campaign finance reform. Justice meaning access to the political system, which, of course, requires campaigns so different than finance so differently than what we have now. Working with secular advocacy groups, and we were never single actors. We brought into our strength and built on the strength of people already working on those issues. We joined forces in visiting Springfield, our state capital, to seek the support of individual legislators on pending bills around our key issues. We had successes, always working in collaboration, as I've said. We got an increase in the state welfare grant, a requirement that new housing include space for low-income tenants, established the independence of the Cook County Healthcare Board system from oversight by a county board that was driven as much by patronage as for competent management of healthcare. One of our major initiatives came from a staff member who observed that many individuals, mostly black, had no real chance of a second option upon release from prison. And this led to our first foray into criminal justice. We helped to pass legislation requiring that at the very least, public entities like the city of Chicago not preclude hiring anyone with a criminal record. If you had a criminal record and you applied to pick up papers with a spike in the Park District of Chicago, you couldn't be hired. We changed that, along with many others. As we traveled to Springfield on behalf of this cause, it became obvious that because of our obscene national policy of drug criminalization, most of these individuals should not have been in jail in the first place. And this has led to my continuing commitment over the past 10 years to end the war on drugs and seek a health, not punishment response to drug use by creating a new organization. It's now ongoing, Clergy for a New Drug Policy. So now surely you can see the influence of Chris and Schubert in all this. Reason and persuasion were the rule of the day. I remember teaming up with Chris to present our 4-part discussion series in a Wednesday evening dinner session in a very privileged Episcopal church on Chicago's Gold Coast. Lace tablecloths, candles. At the end of the last session, as Chris and I got in his car to drive home, he asked me in his usual kind and deliberative way, "Al, do you think we changed any minds?" The organizational paths we did not choose are instructive. We most decidedly were not community organizers of Saul Alinsky United Power model. We did not shout and call politicians out in front of packed gatherings seeking confrontation through venom and large numbers. And again, the reason was the rule of the day. Charlie Kirk need not apply. These days are over now, and how fondly I remember them, if only because of the guidance of Chris, the encouragement of Phil and Alex. As Bill Coffin used to say, for 15 years, we experienced the thrill of being in the right fight. May the fight continue with you at the forefront, inspired by the vision of Chris Gamwell and Schubert Ogden. And I would say that the model we developed is a model you can bring to church congregations. I know some of the techniques to do it. One thing I gradually came to realize is that even if most people in the congregation didn't think politics and religion mixed, certainly not in their congregation, there's always a core of leadership in any congregation that is willing to step forward and begin to mobilize if they're approached in the right way. So I have a lot more to say about how you can, as ministers, create the environment of pursuing politics in a congregational setting. I will tell one final story, which I think spells out how you can do it. I was doing my discussion series at Fourth Presbyterian Church in downtown Chicago. Marty was the preacher of the day. Marty came nicely to my little discussion session, and so to kind of put him on the spot, I said, "Marty, do you think we ought to have religion and politics in churches?" And he said in his very deft way, didn't answer the question except to say, "I can imagine a church in which you have a committee on housing and a committee on welfare and a committee on criminal justice, and all of a sudden you find you have the spirit of church." And that's what I think we ought to work for. I do have some comments about how we should respond to the religious right now that it's a battle for Christian nationalism. We thought we were taking on the religious right. I don't think we laid a glove on them. I think we need to take some gloves off in a different way, and I have some ideas about how to do that, but I'll leave that to discussion.
Thank you very much. Let's thank all 4 of the panelists. We have about 10 minutes in which we could do some Q&A with our panelists. If anyone would like a question.
I think that, Al, what you said sounds to me, Al Sharp, sounds to me as if it would be very well heard and responded to by the McGuire Center.
By what?
The McGuire Center. We heard about earlier.
Oh, okay.
For social ethics and social responsibility. And there's been a very nice, just a response to your comments, a heartwarming combination that testifies to what you think and what reasons you have to think it are important for what you do with your life and what difference you try to make. I mean, these things are so basic. To be a conscientious human being.
Thank you. Anyone else? Becky?
Okay, hold on.
Okay, so I like
Wait a second.
Wait. We have online people listening.
Paul, your forecast wasn't pretty for the future of, I don't know, mainline, especially progressive groups. So I would like to ask you and the rest of the panel, and including Brian, so what next?
I already said I don't know.
But you've got to have, if you've been thinking about the sad part that much, you have to have some, you have to have been coming up with some, surely.
I think it was in the previous discussion where the issue was raised about the limits of human rationality, something, I don't know if that's the way to put it, but I think you identified it, Dan, that their rationality is an ideal, but for all of us, there's so many non-rational and sometimes even irrational factors at work in our lives that I've become convinced of how true this is. I'm so exhausted emotionally from arguing with people about so many issues that, I have to be very cautious these days not to expend myself I just can't take on everybody who has a view that I disagree with. I have to believe there's really some teachability, a teachable spirit, as John Calvin put it. And I realize that so much of what I see around me in my society is not any spirit of teachability.
And on to the hope.
I don't want to say I have no hope at all, but I have no strategy to propose. I don't have anything. Well, good. Well, don't work on me. The problem is not me and my lack of hope. I need some answers. How to deal with people who refuse to engage in rational conversation. Let's put it that way.
Let me try a bit of an answer. It seems to me, we've heard all day about what was true is true and what we learned from Schubert, Ogden, and Chris Gamwell. The church is stalled. There's certain ministers, certainly in my time, have not taken those truths and made them real in language that people can understand. If you go to any congregation, there's such a gap between what ministers, especially good ministers who've gone to seminary, understand, and who understand Ogden and Gamwell, and what people in their congregations believe, because the ministers haven't made the translation in terms that people can understand. Most people in congregations wouldn't understand a word of what you said today. Right. The ministers who do haven't translated those words into what people in congregations need to hear. For example, salvation now. I remember Phil taught a wonderful class to students in Maine who were divinity school students, and with tears in his voice and his eyes, he said, "Every day is Christmas," meaning the idea that salvation is present to us here and now. People in our congregations don't have any idea what salvation means. There was the best activist in Clergy for a New Drug Policy was a woman who took all our ideas and had discussion series in churches. And she said, "I'm just here because I really love what we're saying. I don't believe in salvation. Salvation doesn't mean anything to me, but this meant something to her." We haven't made that translation. Another one now is, and I've only recently come to appreciate that as I've done some rereading, the difference between, and it's because of my work in criminal justice, a God of abundant grace. A God of abundant grace and a God of law and enforcement. What is most massively wrong with our criminal justice system is we still have legally a criminal justice system that is based on retribution. The contrast, of course, is restorative justice. If you read anything about restorative justice and the theologians that support it, they say Jesus never once talked about punishment. Well, I think that's theologically true. There are complicated questions about what you do in a secular justice system, but the fact is our justice system now has no concept of a God of abundant grace. Where is the minister that's talking about the difference between the God 2,000 years ago and a God who's a God of love and persuasion and a God of abundance grace? So ministers have not learned how to make the translation. That's the first thing. The second thing is what you said really so clearly. What is religion? Truth is self-authenticating. I think that's what Schubert and Chris were trying to say to us. And if it's self-authenticating, we need people that somehow embody it. They are few and far between in the worlds we live with in the church, and we somehow have to to bring them forward. And I think that will happen. So unlike you, I'm an optimist.
I want to pick up on one thing John said and throw in my one contribution here, and I'll be a bit of a contrarian. I don't think reason is the answer. I don't think appeals to reason are the answer. In fact, I think the arts are probably going to be more of a solution to this, and it's the artists who've been gathering around and actually making some progress in defeating some of this overreach by the conservatives. And it's movies, it's music, it's the church that knows how to sing in public. It's William Barber getting out there and joining arms. I really think that that's where the church is. I'm not saying that we want to be irrational at all, but I just think there's so much more to how we counter this than appeal to.
May I pick up just make a comment on that? I would put it this way, and I realize this is simple, but the church has to be, the liberal church has to be more than the Democratic Party at prayer. I mean, there has to be an experience, a life-giving experience of grace. Otherwise, why do I want to go to church? They're going to ask me for money. They're going to ask me for time. I can just go down to any number of organizations and contribute and make a change in society. I don't need the church to do that. So I think it has to be a both and. A both and. There, I read recently a statement by James Baldwin, who talked about, sure, we've got to address the systemic evils of society, but he also said there has to be a personal transformation as well as a social transformation, and I'm not sure we're offering that.
That's what I mean. I said we don't have a gospel anymore.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
That's right. All right, one more. Karen Baker Fletcher, Dr. Baker, Karen Baker Fletcher. Bring it up.
Brian, so now I want to be a contrarian. So I agree with you that it is that the arts are making a real difference and can make a real difference. I would just want to ask, what do you mean by reason? Because artists are also using some kind of reason to claim what they know is true in the art that they create. Even if it's at an unconscious level or preconscious level, when asked about it, they can think about it and talk about that. And so we're often using reason when we think we're not using it. I guess I just wanted to say that.
Can I respond or should I not? I don't know. Well, I'll just say simply, maybe it's more of an appeal to, this is also troubling, but common human experience. And I think that also could be a very problematic construction. But I do think, and I agree with Martin Luther King Jr., that to expose the inhumanity of others, nonviolence did that in a way that reason could never, abstract reason. But if you think of reason as interwoven with basics of common human experience, I think there's something there as a combination there. And that's what this whole conference really has been, not just about reason, but about also common human experience too. So there's the ding right there. That's it. So I'll turn it back over.
And we'll take that ding as a sign from up above. And with that, we will draw the panel on. Okay, there we go. So we'll draw the panel on ministry to a close on that note. Many thanks to our moderator, Dean Stone, and to our four panelists, Reverend Dr. Kavitz, Reverend Sharp, Dr. Suhaki, and Reverend Wright. Well, that also concludes today's formal program. On behalf of my co-chair, Dr. Walker, and the other members of the Planning Committee, as well as all of today's speakers and respondents, and to you, the audience, we hope that everyone has been enlightened and edified by this conference, is encouraged to commence or continue your own study of the works and achievement of Schubert, Ogden, and Franklin Gamwell. For those of you who have joined us online, we thank you for your presence and participation. A recording of the conference webinar will be made available in the very near future. An email will be sent to all registrants regarding that webinar, including instructions on accessing it. For those of you who have joined us in person, we now invite you to a post-conference reception in Gill Hall, right out here, sponsored by the Perkins School of Theology. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.